Chapter 593. As the largest and most bloated organization in the Dark World, the headquarters of the Polar Ground Alliance was located on a relatively flat glacier in the polar region. The headquarters was less than 300 miles away from Mormons, just out of the border of snow country. In the past many years, this glacier, which did not belong to any country in Eastern Europe and meant the Dark Plain in the language of snow country, was the center of all the dark forces in snow country. The collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance was too sudden, and its internal structure was so bloated that even if it collapsed vigorously, the speed of the Polar Ground Alliance's disintegration was still extremely slow. After the destruction of the Violet and Morton families, the remaining core figures of the two families went deep into the polar region and the Dark Plain as soon as possible. A large amount of wealth of the two families was taken away by them, and then some experts of the Eastern Church were recruited. In the case of Tyrant's disappearance, the two families restabilized the control of the Polar Ground Alliance in the shortest time. However, without strength, the control in name and interests was ultimately an illusion. While the remaining important figures of the Violet and Morton families were still dreaming of revenge, the news of Tyrant's return had spread throughout Eastern Europe. The violent vanguard had spread to every corner of Eastern Europe. Before the two families and the Polar Ground Alliance could react, Tyrant had entered the Dark Plain alone. An extremely bloody and violent suppression followed. 3 hours later, Tyrant, who had returned and recovered to his peak state, killed 21 thundershocking realm experts of the Polar Ground Alliance and slaughtered half of the remaining elite knights of the Eastern Church. Countless elites of the Polar Ground Alliance who chose to support the Violet and Morton families turned into corpses and minced meat in his hands. Ivy Violet, who used to be the third in the Violet family and could be regarded as the cousin of the president of Snow Country in terms of blood relationship, was broken by him. The old patriarch of the Morton family wanted to kneel down and beg for mercy. At the moment he knelt down, Tyrant had kicked his head away. Straightforward, bloody, violent, and ferocious. A conflict broke out between the elites who were still loyal to Tyrant and those who surrendered to the four families. The war and bloodshed lasted for a short period of time. 2 of the 4 families were destroyed, and the other 2 entered Xianxia state. Tyrant, who was completely free from the shackles, was extremely decisive. According to the information he obtained, he directly removed all the spies belonging to Rekvia and the Qin clan. In less than a few hours, Tyrant had become the only will in the Dark Plain. The elites of the Polar Ground Alliance that were still in the headquarters began to assemble. On the flattest part of the glacier, large armed transport helicopters of Snow Country were already in position. On the Dark Plains, densely packed figures were moving. They held weapons and carried killing intent. Target: Mormons. Tyrant sat on the throne in the middle of the Alliance Hall, looking out the window into the distance. His line of sight passed through the glaciers and seemed to have seen the purgatory where every step he took was made of flesh and blood. Tyrant was expressionless as he touched his wrist. He wore a dark red bracelet on his wrist, and a dazzling scarlet gem was embedded in the center of the bracelet, shining brightly. That was Tyrant's biggest trump card. Among the 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World, it was second only to the Human Emperor. Its shooting speed was the fastest, and its single-target lethality was not inferior to that of the Human Emperor. Formless grace. Tyrant's restless heart gradually calmed down. After the battle with the master of Samsara Palace, he fell everywhere in Eastern Europe, and his state of mind was overturned. Now he had a vague sign of a breakthrough. If he took this small step forward, he would be closer to the peak of the invincible realm. Even if he couldn't break through, he would be a little stronger than he used to be. In this state, he held the formless grace that had been fully charged. With the murderous weapon in hand, he would not be inferior to any expert at the peak of the invincible realm in terms of lethality or deterrence. The chaos was bloody, and the general trend was surging. Tyrant touched the formless grace and once again confirmed a fact. He already had the qualification to decide the general trend. "Your Highness," the president called. An expert of the Polar Ground Alliance from the military of Snow Country walked quickly into the hall and respectfully handed the phone to Tyrant. Tyrant took it and said calmly, "Mr. President, how is the Dark Plains?" The president of Snow Country's tone was low. I killed Ivy. Tyrant was silent for a while and said blandly. Ivy Violet. She was one of the core members of the Violet family. Before it was destroyed, the reason why the Violet family was considered the first family in Eastern Europe by most people was that they had a huge influence in Snow Country. In the past 100 years, the Violet family had produced 4 presidents and 3 prime ministers of Snow Country. The current president of Snow Country was also from the Violet family. The president of Snow Country was silent for a moment and said blandly, I see. How is the Dark Plains? Everything is under my control. Tyrant's voice was cruel and fierce. My people are gathering. Within 3 hours, nearly 30,000 elites of the Dark Plains will enter Mormons. The winner will be us. In the low breathing sound, the voice of the president of Snow Country sounded. Your Highness, you only have 2 hours. Okay. Tyrant hesitated for a moment before he made up his mind. 2 hours then. The president of Snow Country agreed. Although he was from the Violet family, he did not care about Ivy's life or death. As one of the longest-serving presidents in the history of Snow Country, President Jia disagreement with the Violet family had become more and more serious in recent years. This was not because he was not a direct descendant of the Violet family, but because of the natural opposition between the ruler and the wealthy capital. The Violet family was too powerful in Snow Country. Such power was beneficial sometimes, but more often, the Violet family was like a blood-sucking tumor lying on the lifeline of Snow Country. President Jia was a very accomplished president of Snow Empire, but most of the time, he was still restrained by the Violet family. Once some of his measures, or in other words, were likely to violate the interests of the Violet family, he would immediately face tremendous pressure. If he did not violate the interests of the Violet family, Snow Empire could not achieve a real rise. The Violet family did not care about the so-called national economy. But this was something that Jia had to consider. The sudden destruction of the Violet family was a disaster that broke out abruptly for Snow Empire. Since the destruction of the Violet family, millions of people in Snow Empire had lost their jobs, and the declining economic strength had become increasingly depressed. This also made Jia see the essence of the Violet family more clearly. If this disaster could completely remove this tumor, Snow Empire, which had lost the Violet family, would seem to be greatly weakened, but the future would become more hopeful. On the other end of the phone, in the palace of Snow Country, President Jia shook his head and then said, the situation in Mormons is very complicated. The Beihai Core, Samsara Palace, and Purgatory of Heaven Capital are all enemies, but when facing us, their positions are very consistent. At present, Mormons has lost 3 legions, full legions. Your Highness, you know what this means. This price is too heavy. I need your help. I understand. Tyrant was silent for a while, then nodded. I will speed up the gathering speed of the Polar Ground Alliance and set off in the shortest time. 2 hours. I need at least 2 hours. The corner of Jia mouth twitched, but he did not continue to embarrass Tyrant. Tyrant had suppressed the Polar Ground Alliance fast enough. After the bloody battle of internal strife, it would take time for the personnel to gather and recondense their combat effectiveness. 2 hours, indeed, could not be any less. Although this meant that Snow Country needed to fill in another legion or even more people to fight for this time. I can give you 2 hours, but you must be fast. Jia held the phone tightly, and his tone was almost a low roar. Tyrant did not say much, but simply and resolutely responded, Snow Country will win. He hung up the phone and walked out of the hall of the Alliance. It was busy everywhere in his sight. There were more and more people in the Polar Ground Alliance. Tonight, even if Tyrant did not care about the title of the Chief Marshal of Snow Country, he had nearly 30,000 available elites on the Dark Plane. These were the elites of the Dark World. In the Dark World, the so-called elites had the clearest definition. The elites who had entered the 4 realms of martial arts and completely stabilized the ice-condensing realm were the real elites. Tyrant raised his palm with a bracelet and held it tightly. In the process of closing his palm, what he touched was not nothingness, but power. Boundless power was in his hands. his strength, his army, his murderous weapon. They were all power. Tyrant looked into the distance with no expression. His eyes were a little dazed. He held the power that might overturn the general trend. At this moment he thought of Snow Country, the Wang family of Beihai, the Samsara Palace, and the Polar Ground Alliance. These were like one road after another. Tyrant never found that he had so many choices now. He smiled a little self-deprecatingly and thought of a sentence that the famous marshal of Zhongzhou State once said. A soldier had no choice. So he was now the chief marshal of Snow Country. But after all, he could not be regarded as a soldier. When he hung up the phone, the morning sun over the capital of Snow Country had begun to rise gradually. The summit of the countries that lasted for nearly a night was finally over. A night of bloodshed and turmoil. The war that broke out abruptly began to decline after the peak. The flames of war were still burning all over Eastern Europe, but there was a tendency to gradually extinguish. There were only two real main battlefields. From Snow Country to Reki City. Mormons. At present, the battlefield from Snow Country to Reki City had suffered unprecedented setbacks. The defeated troops of the 6 legions were continuously returning to Snow Country, and Mormons was also in a stalemate. These two core battlefields were all presided over by Snow Country, and Snow Country had suffered great losses as a result. But Jia Delin's expression was still calm. After ending the call with Tyrant, he seemed to be a lot more relieved. In this extremely long and turbulent night, it was Snow Country who initiated the war. The real beneficiaries were the other Eastern European countries in Snow Country's camp. Both the defeated and Snow Country suffered heavy losses. But if countries wanted to keep their interests, they had to help Snow Country. So after the meeting, the coalition forces of various countries had appeared on the road to Snow Country in a mighty manner. At present, there were no real experts in Eastern Europe except Tyrant. But they had enough troops. Hundreds of thousands. Millions of people pushed over together. Peak of the invincible realm? Half-step chosen one? There was a ferocious look in Jia Delin's eyes. Go to hell. He firmly believed that he would be the final winner and that Snow Country could laugh to the end. Once this war ended, the whole of Eastern Europe would undergo earth-shaking changes. The countries in Snow Country's camp would unite around Snow Country. Without the restraint of Violet, Snow Country would get through the painful period of the war at the fastest speed, and then usher in the fastest development. Snow Country could even annex these countries that were standing beside Snow Country at this time and form a new Snow Country Federation. During his term, he would lead Snow Country to the peak again, to compete with Zhongzhou State and Star State. Jia Delin's name would also be recorded in the annals of history forever. All of this was great. The president got up from his seat and planned to enjoy today's breakfast. Bang! The hurried sound of the door being pushed open suddenly sounded. The secretary who had been by Jia Delin's side for many years staggered in. She was flustered and in a hurry, and her face was full of panic. Jia Delin's mood, which had just improved a little, immediately fell to the bottom. He liked his secretary very much and knew him very well. At present, the other party's performance did not mean that his psychological quality was poor. It could only mean that Snow Country must have encountered some special situations that were completely unexpected. What's wrong? Jia Delin asked. There was a hint of nervousness in his voice that he didn't even notice. Gone. The secretary was out of his wits. He looked at Jia Delin and seemed to want to say something, but he couldn't say anything for a while. He just kept repeating, gone, what's gone? An indescribable uneasiness rose. Jia Delin suddenly held the secretary's shoulder and shook him hard. The secretary's body was soft and fell to the ground as he shook. The moment his body touched the ground, he seemed to come to his senses and suddenly sat up from the ground. His face was pale, and there was an obvious crying tone in his trembling voice. Mr. President, the Divine Shield Core is gone. With an apocalyptic aura, his voice was crazy and a little hysterical, as if he was venting the fear in his heart. In less than 3 hours, the Divine Shield Core is gone. Buzz! Jia Delin's mind went blank in an instant. His body swayed back and leaned against the wall. Divine Shield, he muttered to himself as if he was delirious. After a long time, he suddenly jumped up and roared wildly, "How is it possible? The Divine Shield Corps. My Divine Shield Corps, how is it possible?" The secretary burst into tears and trembled all over. The Divine Shield Corps. This was the largest corps in Snow Country. Compared with the other corps of about 30,000 people, the Divine Shield Corps had nearly 200,000 elite soldiers. It was the largest, most complete, and most well-equipped super-comprehensive corps in Snow Country. The position of the Divine Shield Corps was the Border Corps. Nearly 200,000 troops were stationed on the border between Snow Country and Xianxia State. There were more than 15 generals and 2 marshals in the corps. Such a force was the core force to ensure the stability of half of Snow Country. Now, the secretary said that this force, the Divine Shield Corps, was gone. What's gone? Jia Delin said in a trembling voice. "It's Dongqing Wudi." The secretary cried and choked with sobs. Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre of Xianxia State, led the Black Dragon Army and directly crushed the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps. There were many bits and pieces of news. But Jia Delin could no longer hear it clearly. He could only remember the first few words in his mind. Dongqing Wudi. The whole world knew what it meant to meet Dongqing Wudi in the war. To be exact, it meant what it meant to meet Dongqing Wudi on the battlefield and be defeated. This was the god of massacre of Xianxia State. He was the most outstanding marshal in the world in recent decades, and also the marshal with the strongest killing intent. Those who are my enemies don't expect to keep their dignity. Those who are my enemies don't expect to survive. Those who are my enemies, I'll flatten you, I'll crush you. The murderous voice that once echoed throughout the dark world meant the same fact. Dongqing Wudi's corps did not leave anyone alive or captives. So the defeat of the Divine Shield Corps was not a retreat, but a death. It was gone. On the morning of August 24th, Dongqing Wudi, the god of massacre of Xianxia State and the executive minister of the army headquarters, appeared in the camp of the Black Dragon Army of the Border Control Corps. At 5:15, 80,000 elites of the Black Dragon Army gathered. Dongqing Wudi led the army to attack Snow Country in person. At 8:10, the defense line composed of nearly 200,000 people of the Divine Shield Corps of Snow Country was completely penetrated. Countless people of the Divine Shield Corps died in battle. At 8:40, after a short rest, the Black Dragon Army officially stepped into the border of Snow Country. At this time, the morale of the entire Xianxia State had been completely ignited, and the soldiers of Xianxia State that could sweep everything was ready to move. At 9:30, the border city of Snow Country, Moliai, fell. The Divine Shield Corps, which fled to Moliai City and had no time to breathe, was once again crushed and slaughtered. At 11 o'clock, Alai City fell. Nearly 4/5 of the nearly 200,000 troops of the Divine Shield Corps were killed in the morning. The military flag embroidered with a magic sword moved forward in Snow Country, sweeping everything before it. Dongqing Wudi was stained with blood. Since the beginning of the war, the military flag had been flying at the forefront of the Black Dragon Army, and Dongqing Wudi had been standing at the forefront. He did not retreat even half a step. At 1 o'clock, Anro Castle, the Black Dragon Army, which had less than 60,000 people left, approached the city. Dongqing Wudi stood at the forefront and seemed to be integrated with the army of less than 60,000 behind him. He was invincible in the world. At this time, the president of Snow Country, Jia Delin, who had adjusted his mood, finally began to call Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi answered the phone, but he did not negotiate. There was no threat. Just like the Wang family of Beihai, the Sword Emperor was the emperor of martial arts. And he was the well-deserved god of massacre in the army. Therefore, facing the Snow Empire, he only gave a notice. "I'll have tea with you in the palace of Snow Country within 24 hours. At 1:15, Anro Castle fell. The Black Dragon Army, which had less than 60,000 people, was mighty. At this time, Li Tianlan just finished the last battle and officially entered Snow Country. 2 men, one big and one small. In different directions, they went to different places. He waved his army in snow country. He pointed his sword at Mormons. All this seemed to be just shocking today. However, as time passed, it would definitely become a new legend many years later. Chapter 594. A 10,000-word chapter. The sun was already shining brightly in Snow Country, but the sky inside the palace of Snow Country suddenly darkened. After cutting off the call with Dongqing Wudi, President Jia Delin's body had been trembling slightly, not knowing whether it was because of anger or fear. Wars were often caused by the momentary madness of madmen. Behind this madness, President Jia Delin also realized what kind of price he had to pay. But he didn't expect that the price he had to pay was already unbearable at the beginning of the war. Li Tunlan defeated the 6 legions of Snow Country overnight. This was an absolute shame for Snow Country. But in the chaos, Jia Delin could accept all this. After all, Li Tianlan could defeat 6 legions, but he might not be able to defeat 8. Even if he could defeat 8, what about 10? No one could deny the dominance of real masters and elites on the battlefield, just like no one could deny the role of high-tech weapons on the battlefield. But at the end of the day, war was a fight between people. On a real cruel battlefield, artillery, bullets, and everything else would be destroyed, and masters would fall. Large-scale wars were never the stage for masters in the dark world to show off their skills. A large number of soldiers was everything and the only factor that could determine the outcome of a war. Jia Delin could also endure the stalemate and heavy losses of Mormons. Deity was very strong. The Purgatory of Heaven capital was very strong. The Samsara Palace was very strong. The Beihai Core was very strong. But this was something they had expected. In the final analysis, the reason why Jia Delin dared to launch a war was that the return of Tyrant made up for the lack of top-notch combat capability of Snow Country. After adding this strongest link, Jia Delin was completely confident that the millions of troops of Snow Country would wipe out everything. And although this war was launched by Snow Country, it was far more than the participants. Nearly half of the countries in Eastern Europe, large and small, had already stood in the camp of Snow Country. It would only take one night or even less than one night to wipe out the powerful families that were similar to tumors in their own territories. Then, they would form a coalition army and go straight to Mormons. So in this war, the army of Snow Country was endless, and it could be said to be in an invincible position. Jia Delin had no reason not to be confident. As for Xianxia State was indeed the most powerful country in the world today, but the Divine Shield Corps of Snow Country, with nearly 200,000 troops, was also an elite force second only to the polar bear. In Jia Delin's estimation, even if these nearly 200,000 troops were no match for the Black Dragon Army of the Border Control Corps of Xianxia State, it would not be difficult for them to form a solid defense line that the Black Dragon Army could not break in a short time. Xianxia State would also mobilize troops. The Divine Shield Army would eventually collapse. But this will take time. What Xianxia State lacked the most now was time. In Jia Delin's expectation, when Xianxia State gathered its army and broke through the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps, the final battle of Mormons should have already ended. At that time, he would lead the countless coalition forces of various countries to the south. The absolute advantage in numbers could completely make up for the gap in combat effectiveness. At that time, he might even be able to defeat the army of Xianxia State and force Xianxia State to lower its head and compromise. For example, he could take back part of the land that originally belonged to Xianxia State and now belonged to Xianxia State but used to belong to Snow Country. For example, the territory that the Wang family of Beihai first developed, most of Beihai province, used to belong to Snow Country. Therefore, although President Jia Delin felt heartache for the current huge loss, he was still full of expectations for a better future. But he never expected that the biggest problem turned out to be the Divine Shield Corps, which should not have a problem the most. There were 120,000 people in the Black Dragon Army. Only 40,000 people stayed behind. 80,000 people rushed to the border of Snow Country. In just a few hours, they directly broke the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps. The two marshals of the Divine Shield Corps knew Snow Country very well. The failure of this battle was so straightforward that it stunned people. But the military could not find any dereliction of duty by the two marshals who died in the battle. There was no problem with the defense line of the Divine Shield Corps. There was no problem with the armaments, logistics, and morale. There was no problem with anything. The only problem was that the Black Dragon Army was too strong. There was no conspiracy. In the face of the defense line of nearly 200,000 people, the Black Dragon Army directly rushed up. After the meal, the defense line was forcibly smashed. Such a gap lay in pure strength and fighting desire. This was not a strategic mistake, but it was an extremely fatal oversight. It was not until this moment that the world discovered that the Border Control Corps was the most elite super-large comprehensive army of Xianxia state. This was true. The Thunderbolt Battalion was also the most elite army of the Border Control Corps. This was also true. But the Border Control Corps with Dongqing Wudi and the Border Control Corps without Dongqing Wudi were two completely different concepts. The Border Control Corps. The Dongqing Corps. The God of Massacre Corps. In the Border Control Corps, wherever Dongqing Wudi, the God of Massacre of Xianxia state, was the Thunderbolt Battalion. The attack was like fire. The momentum was like thunder, breaking the sky. The Divine Shield Corps was defeated all the way, and the Black Dragon Army kept rushing. By the time President Jia Delin talked to Dongqing Wudi, there were less than 60,000 people left of the 80,000 people of the Black Dragon Army, while the nearly 200,000 troops of the Divine Shield Corps were defeated, and now there were less than 20,000 people left. There were no prisoners. The death of some soldiers was not even a sacrifice. When the defeat was at its peak, what the losers would encounter was the most brutal slaughter. The defeat of the Divine Shield Corps also meant that the land of Snow Country thousands of miles in the direction of Xianxia state would become extremely empty, because several corps along the way had already sent troops to Mormons, and this empty distance was the distance from the border to Kamas, the capital of Snow Country. Along the way, Snow Country could barely gather tens of thousands of soldiers, but how could the Black Dragon Army care about such a small number? With Dongqing Wudi in charge, the Black Dragon Army was completely insufferably arrogant. Dongqing Wudi said that he would have tea with President Jia Delin in the palace of Snow Country within 24 hours. A distance of thousands of miles. Even if the tens of thousands of soldiers of the Black Dragon Army died, they would follow Dongqing Wudi to the palace of Snow Country. No one doubted this. So in less than an hour after the call, several top staff officers of the military of Snow Country had already arrived outside the palace. President Jia Delin gathered everyone together and held an impromptu meeting. The battle in Mormons was still in a stalemate. The plan to send troops into Reki City was almost aborted. In the rear, the Black Dragon Army was sweeping the land of Snow Country like a ferocious dragon, staining the land with blood all the way. The extremely serious situation made everyone completely realize that the situation was different. It was no longer a question of how much they could win at the cost. The name Dongqing Wudi now really meant the possibility of Snow Country's defeat in this war. President Jia Delin did not talk nonsense, nor was he in the mood to say anything else. So at the beginning of the meeting, he had already pulled out the battle map of Snow Country in the conference room. The northernmost part of the map, which represented the small area of Mormons, was completely crimson. At the border with Xianxia state, there was a large area of conspicuous crimson. Now the crimson was spreading toward the interior of Snow Country, and it was pointing to the capital, Kamas, in an almost straight line. Not far from the crimson region, there were clusters of light blue. These blue dots were moving slowly towards the north. Everyone. President Jia Delin's expression was extremely cold. This is what we are doing now. The battle in Mormons is still in a stalemate, and the combat capability of the Divine Shield Corps is lower than I imagined. The Black Dragon Army of the God of Massacre Corps has officially invaded our southern border. According to the speed of their march, it is not entirely impossible for Dongqing Wudi to have tea with me here 24 hours a day. If this becomes true, I believe that Dongqing Wudi will also go to chat with you after having tea with me. There was a commotion in the conference room. They were all the real big shots in the social class of Snow Country. With the destruction of the Violet family, the capital of Snow Country was temporarily blank. The palace of Snow Country concentrated its power, and their future would be better. At this time, they suddenly found that the war they started was likely to be attacked by others. Anyone would feel panic. So now is not the time to wrangle with each other. I need each of your suggestions. I hope that you can be responsible for your words, because every decision you make now concerns the future of the Snow Empire and even the life and death of each of us. The commotion in the conference room gradually turned into an uproar. In the chaos, an old senior staff officer slapped the table and stood up. He said angrily, "The Divine Shield Corps is incompetent. If it weren't for them, how could we be so passive now? We must hold them accountable. I suggest that they be punished, and it must be." Before he could finish his words, President Jia Delin waved his hand and said, "Come on, take General Long Dimi out." I suddenly remembered that the 7th Legion needs a supervisor to go north to Mormons. General Long Dimi is a suitable candidate. Let him go. The palace warriors in the conference room rushed over and helped the old staff officer. Long Dimi's body stiffened, and his face instantly turned pale. "No, you can't do this." The 7th Legion was one of the 2nd Legions launched by Snow Country. Now it was estimated that it had entered the position of Mormons. Letting him supervise the army in that cruel environment was almost tantamount to letting him die. President Jia Delin was expressionless. "I don't want to hear any nonsense now. I just look at what's in front of me, understand? Deal with the Divine Shield Corps?" All the senior officials died in battle, and there were less than 20,000 soldiers. Deal with them? Deal with who? Even if the Divine Shield Corps was dealt with, wouldn't Dongqing Wudi come? Bullsh *T advice. Get out, get to the front line. I don't need these useless nonsense. Nonsense. Understand? Long Dimi struggled and was dragged out by the palace warriors. In the silence, a middle-aged general stood up. He looked at Jia Delin's face and said cautiously, Maybe we can contact the United Nations and sanction Zhongzhou State." No one spoke. Jude Lin looked at him as if he was an idiot. "How to sanction?" he asked indifferently. In the current situation, other countries were eager to see the result of the fight between Zhongzhou State and Snow Country before intervening. The war had just begun. Although it was tragic, other countries were not fools. How could they intervene without a result? And even if those countries were really stupid and righteous once, how could they sanction Zhongzhou State? Zhongzhou State was now the most powerful superpower. How could such a country be sanctioned? No country was willing to go to war with Zhongzhou State. Economic sanctions? Every time the currency of Zhongzhou State appreciated or depreciated, it directly affected the economy of the world. The so-called sanctions were nothing more than a joke. The lieutenant general's face turned red. He sat down awkwardly and didn't speak anymore. Everyone was looking at the map. In fact, there was a relatively reliable way at present. It was just that no one had said it for the time being. The red area on the map was the area invaded by Dongqing Wudi, and the light red area was his marching route. Around, near, and not far from these areas, there were light blue areas, all of which were Snow Country's own legions. At a rough glance, there were at least 7 or 8 legions in those blue areas, which meant that 7 or 8 legions were rushing to Mormons at this time. If these 7 or 8 legions could stay to stop the defense line, there would be another army of more than 200,000 soldiers. In this way, there would be hope to stop Dongqing Wudi. Of course, this method was good. However, if more than 200,000 troops were detained at once, not to mention the impact on the morale of the army when it suddenly retreated on the way to the front line, how could Mormons make up for the lack of more than 200,000 troops? This question was very important, but it involved their own life and death. In fact, the victory or defeat of the war had already been decided. Therefore, there would always be people who would stand up and put forward such a suggestion. After all, this was the only feasible way. However, in such a situation, whoever stood up and said this first was admitting that he was afraid of death. It was okay to be afraid of death. But in the war, how could a soldier be afraid of death? This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. Once he stood up this time, he would not be able to get his power and status in the future. There was silence. There was a long silence. until the shrill ringing of the phone was suddenly remembered. Jia Delin's arm trembled. He took the phone from the secretary and listened to it for a while. His eyes became colder and colder. He threw the phone on the desk in front of him and said in a cold tone, "The latest battle report shows that Rust City has fallen. The Divine Shield Corps," he paused and said with great bitterness and difficulty, "the whole army was wiped out." There was an uproar. The crimson-red area on the battle map once again spread forward a certain distance. The distance was actually very small. But Snow Country, which had the largest territory in the world, was actually not big on the map. This stretch of distance made everyone shudder with fear. How could it be so fast? In the uproar, a relatively young staff officer finally stood up. This young man, who should have had a great future in Snow Country, said calmly, "Mr. President, I suggest that we immediately transfer back the 7 Corps in the area near Dongqingwudi and form a line of defense to protect Kamas." His voice seemed steady, but it was trembling. No one despised this young man for being afraid of death. Everyone looked at him with gratitude. Jia Delin glanced at him and said in a dull tone, "What about Mormons?" "It's more important here," the young staff officer said quietly. "Important? What's important?" Jia Delin asked. He suddenly stood up and roared hysterically, "What's important here? Because this is the capital? Is there a palace here? If we lose this place, Snow Country will lose face? Bullsh *T. An army of 200,000 people was wiped out in a few hours. F*CKU. Do you have face? Is this place more important than Mormons? If we fail in Mormons, do you idiots know what will happen to Snow Country? Stupid. Idiot. Incompetent." As he roared, everyone lowered their heads, not saying a word. Jia Delin gasped heavily and looked at the silent scene. After a long time, he suddenly laughed. "It seems that you idiots won't have a better suggestion, right?" It was quiet. Jia Delin nodded. "Then, I have a better suggestion." He looked at the young staff officer who was still standing there and said calmly, "Vincent is right. Of course, the capital is important, but compared to Mormons, it's not that we can't compromise here. Even if we compromise, can we defeat Dongqingwudi by detaining these 7 legions? Who has the confidence? Who has the confidence?" It was still quiet. Jia Delin continued to nod. "Look, we don't have the confidence to defeat Dongqingwudi, but what if we change our perspective? Who has the confidence to defeat Wulan State?" Everyone raised their heads and looked stunned. Defeat Wulan State? The army of Wulan State was not strong. After the trial day and the date of death, Wulan State's military power and high-level officials suffered heavy losses. Too many people were sure to defeat Wulan State. "I won't admit defeat," Jia Delin said blandly, "so I want to bet with Dongqingwudi. I believe that the army of Snow Country is a real elite. Give my order." He turned his head to look at the blue light spot on the map and pointed. "Let the 9th Corps and the 14th Corps stand by. Others, continue to go to Mormons." Everyone looked at the screen. On the screen, the positions of the 9th Corps and the 14th Corps were extremely subtle. In everyone's speculation, Jia Delin grinned grimly. "President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State is in Reki City. As long as we take Reki City and capture the president of Zhongzhou State, do you think Dongqingwudi will continue to march?" In the quiet conference room, a group of high-level officials looked at Jia Delin blankly. No one even objected. There was only one thought in their minds. Crazy. Jia Delin was completely crazy. Jia Delin looked at the map. On the map, the 2 corps he had left were only a few hundred miles away from Reki City, much shorter than the distance that Dongqingwudi had traveled to the capital of Snow Country. Jia Delin nodded with satisfaction, looked at the crowd around him, and said blandly, "Who wants to go with me?" In the roar, everyone stood up. Not because everyone was willing to go, but because they were shocked. The meaning of this sentence couldn't be simpler. Jia Delin, the president of Snow Country, was going to attack Reki City in person when Dongqingwudi marched to the capital. The cold wind blew from the barren polar region, bringing with it the broken ice and snow in the polar region. The cold chill seemed to contain endless malice, penetrating into every pore of the body. He walked quietly. It seemed that the war that would last forever had been left behind by him. The desperate shouts and roars of war gradually faded away. Silence enveloped the wilderness. In the empty world, it seemed that only the numb heartbeat was still going on, one beat after another. His heart was completely empty. The scene in front of him was extremely vague. His messy thoughts had become muddle-headed after the intense fluctuation. The numbness covered him with coldness, taking away the low temperature from his body. He could not feel the cold or the pain. When he moved forward, he could not feel any direction or future. It was empty. The whole world had become completely empty. In the deep darkness of the polar night, he staggered and stumbled in the desolate wilderness, like a walking corpse that had completely lost its soul. He didn't know where he was going, what he was doing, or even who he was. The pain in his heart had long since disappeared. His empty thoughts were completely desolate. The obsessions of the past years, whether they were expectations, bitterness, or hatred, all had a meaning of existence after all. But after all the obsessions were completely gone tonight, the so-called world, the so-called everything, seemed to have completely become nothingness. Wherever I went, I would die. Who am I? It didn't matter. The earth began to shake. Flags appeared in the dark and deep night. A dense army surged in front of him. The main battle tanks, which looked like ferocious beasts, opened the way in front. Behind them, military trucks full of troops galloped forward. The army was vast and occupied almost all of his field of vision. He seemed to be unaware of it and walked forward numbly. The barrel of the main battle tank aimed at his body for the first time. In the command room in the center of the truck fleet, his figure also appeared on the screen in front of the general of the Eisen Federation. He was dressed in black, his face was pale, and his eyes were red and dull. Blood stained his black clothes, and a large area of his clothes had completely turned dark red. As he walked, wisps of blood seemed to come out from all over his body. He ignored it and just walked forward, incomparably stupefied. This was an Easterner. The general easily made a judgment. Then he grinned grimly. Tonight, in Eastern Europe, at this moment, any Easterner who was stained with blood had only one end. The general picked up the walkie-talkie in front of the battle map and sneered, "It's a thug from Xianxia state. Open fire and kill him." The muzzle of the main battle tank in front of him turned, and the dark muzzle carried a clear sense of death. The general looked at the cruel scene that was about to happen with interest and muttered to himself, "These bastards should all be killed." The cannons of the main battle tanks were about to roar. The general suddenly changed his mind. "Wait." He suddenly said, "No need to open fire. Just run over and crush him directly into meat paste." His eyes were filled with killing intent and extremely wild. The roar of the tank continued to move forward. The vast army rolled over bit by bit. The two sides were getting closer and closer. He was still walking forward without changing his route, and even his expression had not changed slightly. Countless people in the first batch of troops from the Eisen Federation who entered Snow Country were watching this scene. The distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. 100 meters. 50 meters. 20 meters. His eyes had no focus at all. He just moved forward numbly and didn't care about the impending death. The incomparably tall tank rolled over with a rumble with a shadow. 5 meters. Keep moving forward. In the next second, the entire army heard an incomparably clear sound of something being sliced apart. Crack. It was a crisp and clear sound. It was like the sound of an extremely sharp blade cutting into metal in an instant, clear and crisp, without the slightest sense of stagnation. In the line of sight of the Eisen Federation's general, the huge main battle tank at the very front suddenly trembled. A smear of scarlet red rushed into the sky like a fountain. The huge cannon barrel flew up, and the tank stopped. The thick armor seemed to have been cut in half from the middle in an instant. The cannonball inside the tank suddenly exploded, and a large area of fire engulfed the nearby armored vehicles. The roaring sound occupied the entire vision, and the raging fire burned. Only the clear and crisp cutting sound was still ringing. The general blinked his eyes. He didn't feel angry or frightened. What happened in this instant almost violated all his common sense, so he just felt a little absurd, and even suspected that he was hallucinating because he was too nervous about the coming battle. Explosions and raging fire burned in the army. The entire army was dead silent and looked extremely sluggish. In the fire that almost burned the night sky, the numb and stiff figure walked out. He staggered forward like a walking corpse, and cyclones seemed to be condensing around him by instinct. There were more and more cyclones, and then they continued to elongate, turning into tangible and invisible sharp blades. Thousands of sharp blades danced in front of him, spreading to the entire army. As he moved forward, countless sharp blades cut in between the heaven and the earth with incomparable stability. It was a sharp edge that looked fragile but was extremely fierce and sharp to the extreme. Tanks, armored vehicles, trucks, weapons, armor, flesh and blood. As he moved forward, everything in front of him was directly cut apart. Blood, wreckage, and explosions were everywhere. The entire army stopped. The general finally reacted from this nightmarish scene. He picked up the walkie-talkie and loudly ordered the army to start charging, while he rushed out of the truck without hesitation and began to flee in the direction he came from. The sharp blade that filled the space between the heaven and the earth slowly moved forward. All the charges were incomparably futile. The blood wave that rose into the sky was not fast or slow, but it moved forward with incomparable firmness as he moved forward. In less than 15 minutes, the raging fire was still burning. The wilderness became wilderness again. The explosions and gunshots stopped. Countless corpses that were directly cut in two fell to the ground with blood and the wreckage of armaments, densely covering the entire wilderness. He seemed to not know what he had done and walked forward in a daze. He passed the battlefield full of corpses, walked through the wilderness, and passed through the incomparably deserted city. His figure was getting faster and faster unknowingly. The icy wind of the polar region blew over, with a temperature of despair and deathly stillness, enveloping the entire world. The sound of surging waves in front of him faintly came over. It was getting closer and closer. A huge roar sounded on the sea level. A huge warship with an incomparably huge silhouette appeared in his field of vision and sailed into the distance. He walked from the land to the sea. Under the dark sky, the howling wolves that were surging with the icy wind suddenly became silent. The vast ocean within a radius of a kilometer suddenly became lifeless, stagnant water. The rising murderous intent swept across the bottom of the sea unconsciously. Fish and shrimp, seaweed, shells, reefs, ice. This chapter is not over. Please turn the page. Everything was completely cut apart. The vast ocean without the slightest fluctuation gradually turned red. He stepped on the surface of the water and approached the sea. The warship was still moving forward. The lights were dazzling, illuminating the world. It was unknown which country's fleet it belonged to. All the armed personnel were on standby. Their direction was the only military port in Mormons. Judging from the scale, it was a whole fleet. The night and the black clouds merged into one. The sea was stagnant. He walked quietly on the sea for dozens of miles. Along the way, all the creatures in the sea were completely cut by invisible sharp blades, and the blood had dyed the sea red. He stepped on the red seawater and walked toward the fleet. An earth-shattering sound broke out in the vast ocean. The raging fire began to burn on the sea, illuminating the sky. The huge wreckage of the warship sank to the bottom of the sea with countless corpses. The fire, the explosion, and all the ripples were suppressed by the invisible force in an instant. The battlefield disappeared. He stood on the dead sea, watching the blood spread in the water, feeling lost and desperate. In front of him was the boundless ocean, more than thousands of miles long. Behind him was darkness, and there was no way back. In a trance, he seemed to think of the North Island many years ago. He stood on the coastline of the North Island and looked at Mount Dibbing across the sea. She walked under the falling cherry trees. Her eyes were brighter than the evening sunset. The assassin and the Holy Virgin. The cherry blossoms and the sea. His figure was a little shaky, and all his strength began to decline slowly, bit by bit. But the killing intent that was condensed to the extreme began to rise. He felt the pain, and his will gradually became sober. His firm will flickered. He thought of his life, from childhood to adulthood, many people, many things, countless life and death, and countless separations. He thought of Sidutengye, Li Kuangdu, the high spirits when he was young and frivolous, the picturesque rivers and mountains on Mount Dibing, and the white snow on Mount Taibai. The cherry blossoms on the North Island, the vast sea, and the solemn trial. Pictures flashed in his mind one after another. He looked at the flowers on horseback. He thought of Angel again. The holy land of Italos. All the pictures began to dim and disappear. He suddenly realized that what he remembered most in his life was not Angel. It was not a long time, because it was less than a lifetime. It was not a short time, because he had never died young. What he remembered most clearly was the scene of being separated from Angel and being thrown out of the Holy Land like a dog until today. It was anger, unwillingness, longing, concern, and care. For so many years, all his emotions were obsession. He became stronger at all costs. The only thing he wanted to do was to go to the Holy Land again and bring his woman back. Tribulation. It was obsession in itself. He stood on the sea, and his eyes were burning. That was the raging fire of Mormons. Countless saint warriors were gathering. Her body was nailed to the cross. Blood flowed and floated in the air. The fire was burning, twisting the air. That was the last time. He did not see her face clearly. Her expression. In the space distorted by the fire, the last time, the last time. The only thing he could touch was the vast will. She turned into ashes in the raging fire all over the sky, and the dust drifted all over the sky. She did not even leave a word. They met again after so many years. If she could speak, what would she say? What did she want to say? What else could he say? He thought quietly and finally understood that no matter what she would say, it was no longer important. Because she was gone. He began to cry again. Standing on the vast sea, surrounded by the vast and silent ocean, the night fell and merged with the black seawater. The murderous aura continued to spread. It was not until this moment that he really realized that he really had nothing left. He stood quietly, no longer moving forward, no longer pursuing, as if he would stand until the end of time. Until a voice sounded in his ear. It was peaceful, indifferent, calm, and casual. This low voice easily pierced through his killing intent and appeared in his ears. "Are you waiting for me?" He did not respond. The voice sounded again, "Can you stop me?" He raised his head and looked ahead. Wang Tianzong, in a black costume and carrying a huge sword, walked over from the sea. He crossed the mountains, walked across the plains, and crossed the sea. 1,000 miles were behind him, but he was not tired at all. Instead, his spirit became more and more vigorous. Tribulation's eyes were a little confused, and his voice was hoarse. "She is dead." Wang Tianzong was stunned and then fell silent. It didn't matter who Tribulation was talking about. What mattered was that there was only despair and emptiness in his tone. He could not understand such a feeling, but more than 20 years ago, at a certain moment, he felt the same way. Wang Tianzong looked at Tribulation and felt his rising and completely out of control killing intent. His state was declining, but the condensed killing intent with endless sharpness had broken through the scope of the half-step chosen one and truly reached the supreme domain. His eyes were a little emotional. When he was young, Tribulation had been with him for a while. At that time, he and Li Kuangtu were still brothers. He and Tribulation were not friends. But Li Kuangtu and Sidu Zhangyue's younger brother was also his younger brother at that time. Wang Tianzong thought quietly. At that time, Wang Xiaoyao seemed to have a good relationship with Tribulation. He was also optimistic about Tribulation's future. But he had never thought that when he was at his strongest, the strongest opponent he met in his life turned out to be Tribulation. Tribulation stood in front of him on the sea. In front of him was his path. "I can understand your mood," Wang Tianzong said slowly. His words were a little pale. Tribulation looked at him blankly, with only confusion. Wang Tianzong was silent for a long time before he said again, "Where do you want to go? I'll send you." "Do?" Tribulation looked at him and smiled bitterly. "You want to send me? Is there anyone else who can send me?" "I can." Wang Tianzong said lightly. Tribulation's smile grew bigger and bigger, but also more and more bleak. The last tear flowed through his eyes and down his cheek, falling. He opened his mouth softly and said vaguely and hoarsely, "Okay." Wang Tianzong's eyes gradually burned and were extremely bright. His voice sounded clear and faint. "Have a good trip." Tears fell into the vast sea. Ripples appeared on the still surface of the water. The ripples spread out. Under the dark sky, the whole sea area roared wildly in an instant. Monstrous waves rushed to the sky thousands of meters high in an instant, and water drops with sword intent covered the sky. Tribulation let go of everything and rushed directly to Wang Tianzong. The space was completely shattered by the killing intent. Light and shadow suddenly lit up in the endless darkness and silence. Tribulation's martial arts began to collapse. All his strength retreated to the chi-controlling realm, and then rose wildly. Ice-condensing realm, fire-flaming realm, thunder-shocking realm. He entered the invincible realm in an instant. The peak of the invincible realm. Half-step chosen one. Supremacy. An unprecedented glory and pinnacle gathered on his body. Monstrous waves surged and gathered as he rose. Tribulation opened his hands. At this moment, he held almost the entire Arctic Ocean in his hands. In the shortest time, the huge wave rushed across the sky of tens of thousands of meters, like a roaring gathering rising from the sea. With condensed sword intent, it broke through the space, devoured the void, and directly arrived in front of Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong pulled out the huge sword behind him. Coldness of 9 states. Buzz. A clear sound suddenly rang out between the sky and the sea. The black huge sword appeared clearly in Tribulation's sight through the huge waves tens of thousands of meters away. Everything engraved on the blade seemed to light up. The sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers, and everything in the world. They were all reincarnated. They were all one sword. This sword was here. Wang Tianzong's figure seemed to be standing in another world. He pulled out the sword in another world. The sun and moon were above his head, and the rivers, lakes, and seas were all trembling. That was the most essential sword. A simple, pure sword. The sharpness that filled the world gathered on the sword edge, smashing the night sky and tearing the huge waves. The sword energy kept filling his eyes. It was extremely real, but also extremely illusory. Light and darkness were constantly alternating in this sword. Between day and night, the extremely explosive sword energy instantly arrived in front of Tribulation. Boom! In the extremely loud roar, the sea surface tens of thousands of meters around suddenly sank. There seemed to be a scorching sun in the dark night sky. It was illusory and real. The sun, moon, and stars were all sword light. The sea area tens of thousands of meters turned into a huge vortex under the completely boiling sword energy. The vortex kept spinning on the sea level, and every drop of water carried the alternating light and darkness of the sword light. The most perfect sword intent. The most extreme outbreak. 6 paths of reincarnation sword. The coldness of 9 states, which was used with all its strength for the first time, trembled slightly with extremely clear excitement. Wang Tianzong stood in the sky and looked down at the sea area. There were no huge waves in the sea area, and there was no tribulation. Only the vortex was left. Only the ocean was left. His body moved and slowly withdrew the sword. A faint sound came. He lowered his head. A gash appeared in his hand, bringing with it fresh blood. The blood flowed into the coldness of 9 states and was absorbed by the sword. Wang Tianzong looked at his palm. After a long time, he raised it gently. He raised his arm little by little. The process was very slow. With his movement, there were countless cracks on his palms, wrists, legs, face, and almost every part of his body. The sharpness tore his skin. In an instant, Wang Tianzong was covered in blood. He put the coldness of 9 states behind him again. Wang Tianzong's figure in the sky suddenly fell down, and a large mouthful of blood instantly sprayed out. His face was pale, but he was laughing, extremely comfortable. His body fell in the center of the vortex in the sea, and he opened his hands. At this moment, between the sky and the sea, Everything revolved around him and was in the palm of his hand. The emblem of the Wang family of Beihai was the sky and the sea. And today, August 24th, between the sky and the sea, Wang Tianzong finally crossed the boundary and made up for all his imperfections. In the final outbreak of tribulation, he officially entered the supreme realm. Moreover, flawless, Wang Tianzong closed his eyes. The loud and vigorous heartbeat swept through the waves and resounded through the world. All the wounds on his body began to heal. His aura was completely stable, far better than before. With the endless sword intent, like a whirlpool of reincarnation, he disappeared on the sea level. Wang Tianzong turned around. Across the sea and the mountains, he looked at Mormons who was getting closer and closer to him. The city that had become a purgatory was everything he wanted to conquer. "I'm coming," he whispered. End of this chapter. Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 595. The reason why lunatics were called lunatics was because they dared to do it, could do it, and were willing to do things that ordinary people would not even consider. Countless histories had clearly shown one truth. There was only half a step between insanity and stupidity, and similarly, there was only half a step between insanity and wisdom. The flames of war filled the air, and smoke was everywhere. The turmoil that was enough to topple all of Eastern Europe continued to spread. As the longest-serving president in the history of Snow Empire, as the initiator of this war that was enough to be recorded in the history books, when the higher-ups of Snow Empire were considering life and death, Jia Delin only considered success or failure. Dong Chengwudi commanded his army to go north, and his sword pointed straight at Kamas. The situation was so clear. The Black Dragon army unreservedly vented their sharpness and combat power in Snow Country, telling the world their terrifying combat power. There were several legions of Snow Country along the way from the border to Kamas, but no one could guarantee that these legions could stop Dong Chengwudi. Moreover, leaving these legions was equivalent to compromising with Mormon's battle situation. No one could predict the consequences, and no one could bear the responsibility. Jia Delin thought that this war was the best time for him to get his hands on enough chips. To put it bluntly, he couldn't afford to lose in the face of variables. Dong Chengwudi was unstoppable. The only thing he could do was to fight for time. If he couldn't beat Dong Chengwudi, he would race against time with him. The strong and iron-blooded order was directly issued to all military bases in Snow Country as soon as the meeting ended. Almost all the fighter jets that could be on standby received specific orders. Snow Country's satellites and radars began to monitor all of Eastern Europe. Snow Country, which claimed to have the largest spy network in the world, launched all the spies and agents, and the follow-up means were turned over one by one. Blocking the airspace of Eastern Europe. Blockade the land of Eastern Europe. Immediately, the huge naval fleet of Snow Country began to set out to sea. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State was in Reki City. Since he wanted to compete with Dong Chengwudi for the world, he must ensure that Li Huaqing could not leave Eastern Europe. Only in this way could all this make sense. In the process of conveying all the orders, the president of Snow Country, Jia Delin, had already flown directly to the encampment of the 7th Corps and the 14th Corps by helicopter. When Dong Chengwudi wanted to defeat Kamas, the president of Snow Country, Jia Delin, had already begun to carry out the plan to capture Li Huaqing alive without hesitation. Everything was moving forward. Life and death, victory and defeat, there was no turning back. Jia Delin knew very well what this battle meant. It meant the fate of the Snow Empire, and it also meant his own future. In his heart, this was an equally important matter. Eastern Europe, August 24th, afternoon. When Dong Chengwudi, the god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, went more than 200 miles deep into Snow Country, President Jia Delin of Snow Country left the 7th and 14th Corps of Snow Country to conquer Wulan State. In the second hour, the 70,000-strong army encountered a division of the Arctic Ocean Command that had been scattered. The 70,000-strong army was like a ferocious tiger. In less than an hour, they annihilated the defeated soldiers of the Arctic Ocean Command and then began to charge at full speed. The chaos had reached its peak. With the actions of Dongqing Wudi and Jia Delin, the entire international situation began to become complicated and tense. Reki City, Manlisai Hotel. The banquet, which had an incomparably grand beginning but an incomparably chaotic process, continued. The resplendent hall was filled with soft music. One by one, the clan leaders, who were still full of ambition yesterday, began to vent their negative emotions in the hall. Irritation, anger, resentment, fear, and even regret appeared on their faces. Everyone had already known the news of last night. After all, the blockade of Wulan state was not thorough enough. When the first clan leader of a wealthy family learned the news of the war in Eastern Europe, the bad news spread to the whole audience like a plague. Everyone was anxiously waiting for the news. However, after Wulan state learned its lesson, the news was blocked very well this time. All the clan leaders of the wealthy families present were almost under house arrest in the banquet hall. As time went by, the clan leaders of the wealthy families, who did not know the scale of the war for the time being, kept speculating about the news. Their moods also became more and more chaotic in the speculation, and then they lost their composure. At lunchtime, the hotel provided exquisite food. Wulan state was famous for its beauties all over the world. The waiters carefully selected by the hotel had the capital to make people's eyes light up. However, no matter for beauties or delicacies, these clan leaders were not in the mood to enjoy them now. After a clan leader of a wealthy family talked to a waiter with a smile but did not get any useful reply, the clan leader, who was almost completely crushed by the inner pressure overnight, completely turned hostile. He slapped the waiter's delicate and white face and shouted abuse. The situation in the banquet hall suddenly became chaotic. As soon as the chaos appeared, it became calm. A large number of soldiers of Wulan state with live ammunition poured into the hall. The soldier at the front pulled the trigger against the ceiling. As soon as the gunshot sounded, the whole hall suddenly became quiet. The neat soldiers separated the crowd and moved forward. Finally, they guarded around the high platform in the center of the banquet. President Li Huaqing of Xianxia State, who was tightly protected, walked up to the high platform and looked down. His eyes were dignified and solemn. He knocked on the microphone. "Everyone," his voice echoed in the conference room. "I'm here to announce bad news. About 3 hours ago, the war in most areas of Eastern Europe was over." In the extremely silent atmosphere, only Li Huaqing's voice sounded. "Snow Country and their allies have won." Some people looked embarrassed, some were pale, some had dim eyes, and some looked panicked. They were the clan leaders of wealthy families all over Eastern Europe. Now the war in most areas of Eastern Europe had ended, and Snow Country had won. What about their families and foundations? The worst news is that we've got the exact information. This night, it's not just you who were attacked. Some wealthy families who didn't come to Reki City were also targeted by the coalition forces of Snow Country, such as this one. He raised his hand, and a photo that everyone was familiar with appeared on the screen of the banquet hall. Patriarch Clive. Li Huaqing said in a deep voice, "His family is stronger than many of the families here, and it has never had any political inclination in the past. Xianxia State has no contact with the Clive family. But when the war broke out, the soldiers of Snow Country broke into the Clive family. 4 hours ago, Patriarch Clive surrendered and signed a series of property transfer agreements. 3.5 hours ago, Patriarch Clive was shot in his family headquarters. According to the current news, his beautiful wife and daughter have disappeared." A cold and stiff atmosphere suddenly broke out in the silence. *CK. Damn it. These bastards. In the hustle and bustle, everyone had a feeling of sympathy. It was not difficult to imagine Clive's mood when he signed the family property transfer agreement, and it was not difficult to imagine the humiliation he would suffer after his wife and daughter were missing. Li Huaqing's voice was still calm. "There are many such examples. I have no other meaning in saying this. I just want to tell you that there were many reasons for the situation to develop to this point. But the war last night had little to do with your choice to stand by Xianxia State. Snow Country launched the war because they wanted to establish a new order, that's all. I have issued an order through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Xianxia State and given a warning to Snow Country. So, Everyone, you should feel lucky, because you are now friends, partners, and even your own people of Xianxia State. Xianxia State has the obligation to protect you. Snow Country and their allies want your industries. With the warning from Xianxia State first, before you fall into their hands, your families may be under house arrest or locked up, but at least they won't die mysteriously, and they won't suffer humiliation that they shouldn't have. All the patriarchs of the wealthy families in the banquet hall were silent. Everyone was looking at Li Huaqing with complicated eyes, but the atmosphere in the banquet hall was much better than before. At least the strength of Xianxia State was something that all the wealthy families could rest assured about. Li Huaqing casually waved his hand and said, "Everyone, the war is not over yet. I, the standing minister of the army headquarters of Xianxia State, Marshal Dongqing Wudi, has now led tens of thousands of elites of the Black Dragon Army to penetrate hundreds of miles into the territory of Snow Country. It is estimated that Marshal Dongqing will reach Kamas in 24 hours. And the latest news is that Jia Delin is desperate. At present, he is personally leading 2 legions to Reki City. Snow Country is racing against time with Marshal Dongqing. You should all know what this means. Jia Delin wants to capture not only me but also the delegation I brought with me, because those hundreds of people are also important figures in Xianxia State. Similarly, he also wants to capture you alive. What I said is the truth, and I want to emphasize that from now on, I will not leave this hall. The war is going on. Everyone in Xianxia State is taking the same risks as you. And the outcome of the war depends on the speed of Marshal Dongqing and Jia Delin, on the decisive battle in Mormons, and also on you. At this time, if you have any means that you haven't used, there is no need to hide them now. In a few hours, a dozen hours, I hope to still be here to celebrate our victory with you. At that time, the cake in front of us will be the whole of Eastern Europe. Heaven and hell had always been separated by only a thin line. This banquet had now become a complete gamble. The loser would lose all their possessions and their families. The winner would get endless benefits from all of Eastern Europe. Li Huaqing walked down the platform and said, "If anyone wants to quit or seek refuge in Snow Country at this time, you can leave. In the name of Xianxia State, I will not stop you." His figure walked to the lounge at the back of the banquet hall. The patriarchs of the wealthy families in the hall did not move. In the subtle silence, someone finally began to take out their mobile phones. The mobile phone signal had been restored. One call after another was made to all corners of Eastern Europe. The hidden means of the wealthy families began to ferment gradually. Behind the banquet hall was a row of corridors. There were boxes on both sides, which were lounges. It was also a place to talk about some major projects and cooperation. The soldiers escorting Li Huaqing stopped in front of the corridor. Li Huaqing walked to his lounge alone. His expression was still calm, but his eyes were full of solemnity. By now, the chaos in Eastern Europe was no longer a conflict in the Dark World, but a large-scale war involving the whole of Eastern Europe. Xianxia State had been completely involved. The winner would live, the loser would die, and the way to retreat had completely disappeared. At this time, he suddenly missed the Snowdance Corps, which had been frozen on the parade square by Wang Tianzong's sword. If the Snowdance Corps of more than 10,000 people could move freely at this time, the entire Reki City would have at least 100,000 more troops. What was there to fear about the 2 legions of Snow Country? Passing the corner, a clear and melodious laughter rang out. It was the laughter of a young girl, delicate, mellow, and carefree. Along with the girl's laughter, the middle-aged man bragged triumphantly, "Daughter, you don't know that I was standing at the gate of the group at that time." Merson and the leaders of several other consortia bent over and walked down the steps. They even wanted to shake hands with me. Haha, it's a joke. Agreed? How could I agree? I wouldn't agree. The old guy, Merson, almost knelt down to me. Later, in less than 3 months, I directly bought nearly 70% of the 4 consortia's industries, and then sold them and made a lot of money. Li Huaqing was in a daze. He knew what the other party was talking about. However, at this time and in this kind of atmosphere, it was really inconceivable to hear such a conversation. How heartless must one be to brag here when war and artillery could come at any time? He passed the corner and turned his head to take a look. In his sight, Han Donglu, the boss of Zhongzhou State's Flourishing Age Fund, was standing in the corridor with his daughter, Han Xinyan, talking smugly about his past when he was young. Li Huaqing shook his head subconsciously. He knew what Han Donglu had just said. It was many years ago when the Flourishing Age Fund had just risen. At that time, Li Huaqing was still working in Liaodong. The so-called Merson was a financial tycoon in Eastern Europe many years ago and also the most important stepping stone in the rise of the Flourishing Age Fund. The financial war between the newly rising Flourishing Age Fund and Merson's Angel Fund could be said to be really thrilling. Although there was no fighting, every detail was full of unconstrained intelligence. After the end of the war, the Flourishing Age Fund expanded into a real behemoth almost overnight. Today, that war was still regarded as an unsurpassable legend by the industry. He did have the capital to brag about this matter, not to mention that he was bragging to his own woman. It didn't matter if it was exaggerated. But the point was, didn't Boss Han feel that the occasion was wrong? Han Xinyan saw Li Huaqing's figure and pointed her white and tender finger at her father. Han Donglu leisurely turned around with a glass of red wine in his hand and happened to see Li Huaqing shaking his head. He was slightly stunned, coughed dryly, and smiled awkwardly. "Mr. President, I'm sorry. Don't mention it. What Boss Han just said is true. The battle between the Flourishing Age Fund and the Angel Fund has been used as a teaching material by all the major funds. If you want to talk about flattery, they are more exaggerated than you." Li Huaqing joked. Han Donglu laughed and was high-spirited. When his wealth reached such a level, he could really be regarded as rich as a country. In front of anyone, he could freely withdraw and release his wealth. Those people outside should have started to move, right? These wealthy families have been developing in Eastern Europe for many years. Now, although they have suffered setbacks on the surface, who knows how many secret means they have? They are the real local tyrants. The current war is just an opportunity for them to use all their secret means. If they hide it this time, the next time they take it out, it is estimated that they will deal with Zhongzhou State. Han Donglu shook his head, looked at Li Huaqing and gave him a thumbs up. "Good move, President." Li Huaqing narrowed his eyes and shook his head with a smile. "I'm just telling the truth. There must be hidden dangers if these people are locked up here. In that case, it's better to tell them the truth and let them play by themselves. Maybe it will work. Anyway, I'm not lying. After removing the communication shield, they know what they should do." He paused, turned to look at Han Donglu, and said thoughtfully, "Boss Han, you don't seem to be worried at all?" In such a chaotic situation, with Han Donglu's status, he should be the most worried one. In terms of wealth, Han Donglu could be said to have reached the peak. If Snow Country broke through Reki City before Dongqing Wudi, apart from Li Huaqing, Han Donglu could be said to be the most valuable target. If Snow Country could plunder all the wealth of the Flourishing Age Fund, it would be enough to make up for the internal turmoil of Snow Country after the loss of the Violet family. It could even make up for the loss of this war. Maybe it could also increase military expenses for a few years or even longer. Of course, at that time, Han Donglu and even Han Xinyan would also end up horribly. "What are you worried about?" Han Donglu was a little puzzled. The 2 legions of Snow Country are now on the way to Reki City. Jia Delin is leading them in person. Li Huaqing said calmly. Han Donglu nodded. "Oh, 2 legions." His voice was casual and flat. The 2 legions led by Jia Delin were understated in his words, as if Li Huaqing had just said that he had eaten 2 eggs not long ago. "They can't come over. What are you worried about?" Han Donglu took out a cigarette and handed it to Li Huaqing. He sighed and said, "It's a tragedy for Jia Delin. He wants to die, but he doesn't have the chance." Li Huaqing took the cigarette and was a little stunned. "Why can't they come over? Because they have too few people?" Han Donglu's tone was extremely calm. "There are only 2 legions. Does Jia Delin think that he can compete with Marshal Dongqing by leading them in person?" He shook his head. "Are you kidding me?" Han Xinyan took the room card and opened the door of the box. Han Donglu walked in, turned around, and said with a smile, "President, would you like to come in and have a seat?" I have a bottle of good wine here. Li Huaqing was stunned for a moment and looked at Han Donglu. He really couldn't figure out where the other party's inexplicable confidence came from. The two legions of Snow Country had nearly 70,000 people. This was not a large number, but it was definitely not a small number. The base of the Arctic Ocean Command in Im was scattered at the beginning of the war. The entire Arctic Ocean Command was not prepared at the beginning. In addition, Commander Qing Huaining had just taken office. In the command of the battle, although his orders were sound, they had changed. Now the entire Arctic Ocean Command was scattered. As for the four countries around Wulan State, Oga State and Ross State were in the direction of the March of Snow Country. These two countries were small countries. In the past, they advanced and retreated together with Wulan State. Moreover, Ross, Oga, and Wulan State had been severely ravaged by the Snowdance Corps. The armies of the three countries had suffered heavy losses. To put it bluntly, the only obstacle between Jia Delin and Reki City was not the troops along the way. There were almost no troops along the way. The only obstacle between the two was actually the distance. And every minute and every second, the distance was shortening. If not, Jia Delin would not be crazy enough to compete with Dongqing Wudi in speed. After all, a madman was not an idiot. Mr. President? Han Donglu stood outside the door and shouted again, "Don't you want to come and sit down?" Li Huaqing came to his senses, suppressed his inner doubts, and smiled. "I have something to do." Han Donglu nodded and closed the door. He turned around and found that his daughter was looking at him with great curiosity, and the look in her eyes was extremely strange. Han Donglu touched his face subconsciously. "What's wrong? Old Han, are you really not worried?" Han Xinyan was silent for a while, and then suddenly asked, "The army of Snow Country is coming here. Aren't you also not worried?" Han Donglu laughed. He walked to the computer and turned it on. He casually looked at the stock trend chart on the screen, picked up the mouse, and operated it in boredom. "I'm not worried because of you, okay?" Han Xinyan rolled her eyes and poured a cup of tea for Han Donglu. Han Donglu took the tea, took a sip, and shook his head subconsciously. Eastern Europe was different from Zhongzhou State. Because of the environment, tea could almost be regarded as a luxury. Even the so-called special tea provided by the Manlisai Hotel was too far from his taste. Han Xinyan propped her cheeks and looked at her father. Her quiet and beautiful face was filled with confusion. "You are my father. You are here and you said that everything will be fine. Of course, I won't worry, because you will be there to support me no matter what happens." I thought it was okay, but the president just had a lot on his mind. I could feel that he was also nervous. The patriarchs and big shots outside are all nervous and afraid. I don't look down on them, because I know that they are different from me. If something really happens, no one will support them. On the contrary, they have to support the people standing behind them. Old Han, you are the same, but why are you not worried and nervous? Han Donglu's hand holding the mouse paused, and then he said with a smile, "As I said, because they have too few people, don't worry." "But we have very few people too." Han Xinyan stared at her father. After a long silence, she whispered, "Dad, I'm a little scared." Han Donglu narrowed his eyes. An inexplicable emotion flashed through his eyes. In the extremely complicated chart, he reached out his hand and clicked the mouse twice casually. Then he touched his daughter's hair with the other hand. "Don't worry," he said softly, "it's okay." Han Xinyan ignored him. She stared blankly at the stock that Han Donglu had manipulated and muttered to herself, "Old Han, are you really senile? You will lose money if you do this." "What do you mean?" Han Donglu was stunned. He took a deep look at his daughter and whispered, "That's what I mean." He walked to the window with the teacup and opened it. Reki City, which had been disturbed by the wind and rain for several days, finally welcomed the sunshine. It was bright and warm, and the sky was clear. Han Donglu looked at the sky and was silent for a long time. At this time, he was no longer the middle-aged uncle who laughed when bragging to his daughter. His thin figure stood in front of the window, with an incomparably deep power. A melodious chime came from the wall clock in the private room. Han Donglu looked down at his watch and muttered to himself, "At this time, It's almost time to enter the market. When he walked into his own lounge, the secretary was answering the phone with a serious look. Li Huaqing sat on the sofa and waved his hands silently, motioning for the secretary to continue. He poured a cup of tea himself, leaned against the sofa, and closed his eyes to rest. The secretary quickly hung up. He quickly walked to Li Huaqing's side and whispered, "President, it's a call from the Prime Minister." Li Huaqing sat up slightly. What did the Prime Minister say? The Prime Minister hopes that you can leave Reki City. He said that this is the common wish of all comrades. In addition, I also received calls from the old Minister Dongqing, Minister Qi Baitsong, Headmaster Zhuang Huayang, and even some retired old comrades, such as Senior Li. At this time, everyone thinks that you should leave Eastern Europe. The secretary's tone was extremely slow. Li Huaqing was silent and did not speak. The secretary looked at his face and said, "In addition, Marshal Dongqing has called you 3 times to express the same meaning. Eastern Europe has currently blocked the airspace and sea area. But if you want to leave temporarily, the Arctic Ocean Command has a secret base in Eastern Europe. The military will arrange for you to leave temporarily." Li Huaqing glanced at him. With a smile in his eyes, he asked, "What do you think?" The secretary hesitated for a moment. Just as he was about to speak, the phone suddenly rang again. He took out his mobile phone and looked at it, hesitating a little. "It's Marshal Dongqing." "Oh," Li Huaqing said, waved his hand and said, "Don't answer it first. Cut the video." The secretary nodded, hung up the phone, and went to operate the screen. A few minutes later, Dongqing Wudi's figure appeared on the screen in front of Li Huaqing. The god of massacre of Xianxia state, who almost overturned the entire southern part of Snow Country, was covered in blood. His face had been washed. After wiping it with a towel, he became clean again and even looked a little younger. But his eyes were full of solemnity. "President, I suggest you leave Reki City immediately." Without any courtesy, after saluting, he went straight to the point and said, "The secret base of the Arctic Ocean Command is about 400 miles away from Reki City. I will arrange reliable people. You can't go." Li Huaqing directly interrupted Dongqing Wudi's words. Dongqing Wudi froze for a moment and then fell silent. After a long time, he whispered, "A gentleman doesn't stand on a dangerous wall. I'm not a gentleman." Li Huaqing said with a smile, "I'm the president of Xianxia state. No matter where I am, I represent Xianxia state. I'm invincible. In such a situation, what's the point of me leaving? Comrades will understand." Dongqing Wudi's voice was low. "They will understand, but no one will really understand." Li Huaqing whispered, "It may not be difficult to retreat, but if I leave, it will represent the compromise of Xianxia state. Not to mention whether the morale of the army will be affected, even Wulan state will be in chaos in an instant. I can leave, but how can the people I brought leave? If these people fall into the hands of Snow Country, it will also be a disaster for Xianxia state. In fact, for Xianxia state, what's so important about me? The most important thing is the president. If I really die here, the Snow Empire will soon have a new president. Perhaps there will be chaos for a period of time, but as long as you defeat the Snow Empire, the chaos within the country will not cause too much waves." He looked at Dongqing Wudi and smiled. "Remember why I told you I was so satisfied with Tianlan? It's still the same now. He has always been the most satisfactory candidate for the state-protecting war god. Gu Xingyun will compromise and make concessions, but he is not strong enough. The Wang family of Beihai is tough enough, but in Wang Tianzong's heart, the Wang family of Beihai is more important than Xianxia state. Tianlan is different. He will never choose and he has no choice. So no matter what is ahead, he will rush forward. In fact, most of the time, everyone's situation is the same. Tianlan carries the Li family on his back and will not retreat. Behind you are tens of thousands of troops, and behind me is the whole Xianxia state. Standing at such a height, we can't compromise, and we can't afford to compromise. I will stand here." Li Huaqing was silent for a while and said firmly, "No matter what the outcome is, I must stand here, even if I die. Both at home and abroad, my successors will know that the president of Xianxia state is not a position that can be retreated or compromised. Dongqing Wudi did not speak for a long time. Li Huaqing suddenly laughed. In those days, the Li family's young and young highnesses swept across Eastern Europe and created the momentum of Eastern Europe. Now you and your precious son-in-law are also sweeping across Eastern Europe and creating momentum. It's so similar. In a few years, this may be another legend. Momentum. It's easy to get it, but it's even easier to lose it. But it's not easy for Xianxia state to have the current situation. If I retreat, Xianxia state's momentum in Eastern Europe will be gone, so, needless to say. He looked at the screen and said word by word, I won't retreat. Dongqing Wudi was completely silent. When Jia Delin was thinking about victory or defeat, in the face of such a situation, the president of Xianxia state was thinking about life and death. He would not die. Even if Snow Country really attacked Reki City, Jia Delin did not dare to kill Li Huaqing. But at this moment, the president of Xianxia state said word by word that he would die. What this meant was self-evident. Dongqing Wudi did not say much in the end. He silently hung up the phone. The screen went black. Li Huaqing leaned on the sofa, closed his eyes, and hummed softly. In the temporarily modified carriage, looking at the darkened screen and Dongqing Wudi, all the high-level members of the Black Dragon Army did not speak. The army was rushing forward madly, like a torrent, like a huge wave, a raging tide, drowning everything. Dongqing Wudi's voice slowly sounded after a long silence. Did you hear that? No one spoke, but every high-level member of the Black Dragon Army straightened up. The president won't retreat. Dongqing Wudi slowly said, What should we do? All the high-level members took a step forward at the same time. Dongqing Wudi was expressionless. His face was tense, and every pore was full of killing intent and violence. The next second, in the mighty Black Dragon Army, everyone heard the almost crazy roar from the commander. Full speed ahead. Black Dragon Army, charge. The mighty military truck ran fast on the road. Jia Delin sat in the spacious carriage, watching the army's marching route and the battle reports from all over, his face extremely cold. The spacious truck had now become the hub of the whole Snow Country. Countless pieces of important news were gathering in this place. Important news. And all of them were bad news. 5 hours ago, the 5th Fleet of Snow Country was completely annihilated. 2 hours ago, the Black Dragon Army of Xianxia State broke through the city of Seine. An hour ago, Mormons. The 13th Corps was completely annihilated. Half an hour ago, Li Tianlan's motorcade officially entered the Mormons area. At the same time, the Purgatory God of Heaven capital personally took action. The sword light was magnificent and illuminated the whole city. The elites of the Polar Ground Alliance suffered heavy losses. Countless pieces of bad news came one after another. And the only good news was from Jia Delin. The 7th Corps and the 14th Corps of Snow Country were extremely fast. In the full-speed charge, the army had run over Im and rushed into Ross State. Although the few remaining troops of Ross State resisted desperately, they were completely dispersed in a short time. Jia Delin did not even arrange for people to chase after the defeated soldiers. He and his army all focused their eyes in the direction of Reki City. Move forward, keep moving forward. The screen in the carriage was slightly separated. The video of Dongqing Wudi marching into Kamas appeared at the same time as Jia Delin marching into Reki City. Everyone who saw these two routes heaved a sigh of relief. The Arctic Ocean Command was broken up and temporarily unable to support. The military forces of Ross State and Oga State were extremely weak. At this moment, when Dongqing Wudi was less than 400 miles away from Kamas, Jia Delin's army was less than 200 kilometers away from Reki City. In the end, Snow Country won the war for time. Jia Delin's expression was still tense, but the people around him had already smiled. Mr. President, maybe we can get in touch with Reki City now. A major general staff officer came over, looking a little relaxed. Dongqing Wudi was less than 400 miles away from Kamas. In Kamas City, there were about 8,000 palace warriors and nearly 20,000 capital troops. Dongqing Wudi now had only a little more than 50,000 available elites. It would take time to defeat these two elites. This time was enough for Snow Country to completely crush Reki City. Contact, Jia Delin murmured. Yes, it's to practice them and negotiate. The staff officer was full of confidence. Zhongzhou State should have seen the situation clearly. According to our people's report, Li Huaqing has not left Reki City so far. Now Li Huaqing and the lives of countless big shots in Zhongzhou State are in our hands. We can kill them all, but I personally suggest that we cooperate with Zhongzhou State. President Jia Delin glanced at the staff officer coldly and did not speak. Now the situation in Mormons is not optimistic. We can pretend to cooperate with Zhongzhou State, transfer Dongqing Wudi's army to Mormons, and let them break the deadlock for us. Then we can secretly mobilize the army and complete the encirclement of Mormons. At that time, we can wipe out the Black Dragon Battalion and even kill Dongqing Wudi. Jia Delin narrowed his eyes and did not speak. Indeed, they could not solve the problem even if they were faster than Dongqing Wudi. At most, they could relieve the pressure that Dongqing Wudi brought to Snow Country. But even if they caught Li Huaqing, the deadlock in Mormons was still in a stalemate. Even if they forced the Beihai Corps and Li Tianlan's motorcade, the battlefield would still be chaotic. At that time, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, Samsara Palace, and Snow Country would fight to the death. In fact, on the battlefield, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, the Beihai Corps, and the Samsara Palace were also fighting each other. The withdrawal of these two forces would only make the Samsara Palace and the Purgatory of Heaven Capital kill fewer targets. But if they cooperated with Zhongzhou State, Jia Delin frowned and felt a little disgusted. He instinctively disliked the word cooperation. The staff officer immediately understood. He smiled and said, "Cooperation may not be accurate. After all, the president of Zhongzhou State is in our hands. To be exact, we should coerce Zhongzhou State to cooperate with our actions." Jia Delin's brows loosened slightly. He thought for a moment and ordered, "Contact Dongqing Wudi." At this distance, everyone could be completely sure that Dongqing Wudi could no longer catch up with Jia Delin's speed. Even if he defeated Kamas, Li Huaqing and countless important figures of Zhongzhou State would also fall into Jia Delin's hands. At this time, Jia Delin really wanted to see Dongqing Wudi's expression. The god of massacre of Zhongzhou State, strong and iron-blooded, had been strong for most of his life. Therefore, in the current situation, Jia Delin very much hoped to see Dongqing Wudi bow his head and admit defeat. The staff officer personally arranged the call. The call rang and was immediately hung up. The staff officer was stunned and tried again. The call was ringing. Then he hung up. It was self-evident what it meant. The staff officer looked a little embarrassed and said hesitantly, "The other party refused to talk to us." Jia Delin snorted heavily. He thought for a moment and said, "Stop the car and let the soldiers rest in place for half an hour. Contact Wulan State. I want to talk to Li Huaqing." After all, Li Huaqing was not Dongqing Wudi. Therefore, the call was extremely smooth. In less than 5 minutes, the two presidents of the superpowers, who were less than 200 miles apart, had already seen each other through a screen. "Hello, President Li Huaqing." Jia Delin's expression was calm and indifferent. It was a completely confident posture. Li Huaqing smiled. "I'm curious." His voice was low. "At this time, our two countries are at war. I don't think it's necessary for us to talk." "I think it's enough." Jia Delin said calmly, "Your Excellency, I'm less than 200 miles away from Reki City now. Do you know what this means?" "I don't think you can come over." Li Huaqing thought for a moment and said calmly. Jia Delin sneered. "I can bet with you that within 3 hours, my army and I will enter Reki City. Your god of massacre said that he wanted to have tea with me in the palace of Snow Country. Maybe he can't realize his dream, but 3 hours later, I can have tea with you. Your Excellency, how do you feel?" Li Huaqing shrugged and did not speak. "You still have a choice now." Jia Delin said calmly, "Before I get to Reki City, you still have a lot of time to consider the cooperation between Zhongzhou State and Snow Country. As long as the Arctic Ocean Command withdraws from Eastern Europe, Xianxia State helps Snow Country win Mormons and returns the land that once belonged to Snow Country, including the Wang family of Beihai. My army can stop attacking when it arrives in Reki City. Li Huaqing said with some confusion. The Arctic Ocean Command withdraws from Eastern Europe, helps you win all the interests in Eastern Europe, and returns the land, including the Wang family of Beihai. Returns? He laughed. President Jia Delin, are you kidding? Jia Delin laughed in a low voice. Those who know me well know that I never joke. I don't mean that. Li Huaqing shook his head. I mean, why do you dare to make such a condition? Since when does Snow Country deserve to make conditions with Xianxia State? With just your 2 legions? What a joke. With my 2 legions? Jia Delin grinned grimly. My 2 legions are enough to crush the dignity of the entire Xianxia State today. He glanced at the screen and said coldly, Li Huaqing, there are still 60 kilometers left. Wait for me. Soon we will meet. Li Huaqing laughed, stood up and said, bring it on. Before Jia Delin could speak, a sudden chaos suddenly came over. A large number of legions began to be in turmoil, and there was an uproar. Amidst the buzzing sound, everyone seemed to be shouting something in disbelief. Because everyone was talking, no one could hear the specific content. Jia Delin's face changed. He turned off the video and walked out of the carriage. The outside world was already in chaos. The soldiers who were temporarily reorganizing here were running chaotically in every corner, and everyone was passing on a message. Vaguely, the bad news finally reached Jia Delin's ears. Jia Delin's brain buzzed and became blank in an instant. In the afternoon of August 24th in Eastern Europe, on the battlefield of Mormons, the Arctic Army and the Bear Army, which had always been known as the pride of Snow Country, they were all wiped out. Chapter 596. At that moment, it was like entering the cold winter from the sunny early spring. The coldness of the whole world rushed over with ferocious malice. Chaos began to spread without warning. A lot of news, countless analyses, and sophisticated plans were completely disrupted at the same time. Jia Delin's brain was buzzing, and the spreading chill attacked his body. His body swayed, and he struggled to hold onto the carriage. More and more figures kept running in front of him. They shouted and screamed with panic on their faces. This was also Jia Delin's mood at the moment. Only the soldiers of Snow Country knew what Polar Bear meant to Snow Country. Arctic. Polar Bear. These were the 2 armies that had always been at the top since the founding of Snow Country. It could also be said that Snow Country had built these 2 armies at all costs for many years. Joining these 2 armies could be said to be the highest honor for all the soldiers of Snow Country. Countless military expenses, the top high-tech equipment, the treatment of ordinary soldiers comparable to that of middle-level officers, and even some special privileges, each of which showed the special nature of these 2 armies. Almost sparing no effort in training also meant that every soldier of Polar Bear could be said to be a walking arsenal. They were armed to the teeth with real guns and cutting-edge high-tech equipment all over their bodies. Under normal circumstances, even if a team of 5 polar bears were not familiar with each other, they could kill an ordinary reinforced company in just a few minutes with simple cooperation. This was Polar Bear, the strongest elite of Snow Country. To some extent, Snow Country's unstinting propaganda and support for Polar Bear had made all the soldiers of Snow Country believe in their invincible terror and strength. Polar Bear was invincible in the world. This was the belief that the military of Snow Country had always believed in. Many years ago, when Dongqing Wudi first marched into Snow Country, although the Black Dragon Army also defeated the joint forces of the Arctic Army and the Bear Army, and even made them lose their flag in the process of escape, the Black Dragon Army itself also suffered heavy losses. In addition, Snow Country deliberately led all the soldiers to think that it was a strategic retreat and transfer of the military of Snow Country, so the belief of the military of Snow Country was not shaken. After that, it was the top officials of Snow Country who were nervous for a period of time. They tried their best to publicize the strength and sharpness of Polar Bear, so that the army of Snow Country was more convinced. Once the belief was accumulated to a certain extent, it would become a belief. It was different from Zhongzhou State. Everyone in Zhongzhou State also knew that the Border Control Corps was the most powerful army in Zhongzhou State, but it was too large. The major groups in Zhongzhou State also had doubts about Dongqing Wudi. In the past many years, although the Border Control Corps had a high reputation, it had not reached the level of Polar Bear. Moreover, everyone knew that no matter how powerful the Border Control Corps was, there was still the Beihai Corps in Zhongzhou State that was not inferior to the Border Control Corps. In addition, Gu Xingyun had replaced the Li family over the years, and Kunlun City was constantly developing. Therefore, although there were constant internal struggles in Zhongzhou State, it had always maintained vitality. In Snow Country, all the troops only had polar bears in their eyes. Many people didn't even know that the Polar Bear Army was actually divided into two armies. The polar bear became the religion of the army of Snow Country. It seemed that no one had ever thought that there would be a day when their belief collapsed, and to what extent the morale of the entire Snow Empire would collapse. Jia Delin held on tightly to the handle of the carriage. The chaotic shouts from the outside world kept coming in, and the first thing that came to his mind was how the Polar Bear Army had been completely annihilated. What was Tyrant doing? What was the Polar Ground Alliance doing? Jia Delin's heart was suddenly filled with anger. A lot of gunfire suddenly came from the temporarily reorganized army in front of him. Countless artillery fire rang out around Jia Delin. The earth was shaking, and screams and roars of disbelief rang out at the same time. Jia Delin stared blankly at this scene. His brain couldn't react at all, and he looked a little confused for a moment. The sudden outbreak of fighting spread to the entire army in an instant. The March of Snow Country was extremely powerful and rude. Wherever the 7th Corps and the 14th Corps passed, there was silence. At this time, the two armies were in the wilderness and had not been attacked at all. Then everything in front of them, internal strife. Jia Delin's eyes suddenly went black, and he roared angrily, "What's going on?" No one answered his question at all. The fighting broke out completely in a short period of chaos. The 7th Corps, the 14th Corps, every division, every regiment, and every company, in the densely packed camp, almost everyone held a gun and fired at the opposite side at the same time. A soldier of Snow Country looked blankly at his companions who were fighting. He was still hesitating, and the bullet next to him had directly penetrated his chest. Sharp pain spread through his whole body, and he fell down in a daze. The last scene in front of him was that a companion who he was not familiar with was pointing a gun at him, and his eyes were full of suspicion and suspicion. What's going on? The sound of gunfire rang out continuously. Indistinctly, chaotic roars sounded from everywhere and instantly turned into a wave. Hugh has betrayed the country. Traitor, he leaked the information about the polar bear. Kill Jia Delin. Kill Hamilton. The chaotic roars impacted Jia Delin's will. Jia Delin's face was pale. Hugh Albert Milos. This name was not one of the 8 great marshals of the Snow Empire, but he was once the chief marshal of the Snow Empire, and now the chief of the Snow Empire. In terms of power and influence, he could definitely be counted as one of the top 5 figures of the Snow Empire. In the decisive battle in Mormons, Snow Country was led by the new chief martial Tyrant, and the mastermind behind the scenes was Chief Hugh. He was a veteran of Snow Country's army, and his students were all over the world. General Delin, the 2nd commander of the 7th Corps, and General Hamilton, the commander of the 14th Corps, were both students of Chief Hugh, especially the latter, who was the son-in-law of Chief Hugh. Jia Delin shook his head violently. The situation was too sudden, and it was completely overturned in an instant. Before he had time to figure out what was going on, the fighting was already out of control. Until now, he did not even know whether Chief Hugh had committed treason. No, he did not even know how the news of Chief Hugh's treason spread. What kind of battle report would directly reach the ears of ordinary soldiers in the Corps without going through him? Jia Delin was suddenly shocked, and turned to pick up his phone and began to dial. But as soon as he opened the screen, his fingers became stiff. Unbeknownst to him, there was already no signal on the lit-up screen. The fighting continued, and no one could tell what was going on. As soon as the news of the annihilation of the Polar Bear Army spread, the morale of the two corps had completely collapsed. No one knew who was the first to shout out the news of Hugh's treason. Because of the collapse of faith, the soldiers who were eager to find support for themselves naturally began to speculate countless facts that matched their imagination. The speculations of dozens of people began to spread, and in the blink of an eye, a large number of soldiers had already believed that the destruction of the Polar Bear Army was due to Chief Hugh's treason. The commander of the 14th Corps, Hamilton, pulled out his gun in anger and killed a soldier who had provoked the morale of the army. This shot was like a fuse, and all the uneasiness, fear, doubt, and distrust completely exploded. Before Hamilton could put down his gun, countless bullets had already drowned him. Hamilton's personal guards began to fight back, and the fighting was a mess. The nearby panicked soldiers of Snow Country subconsciously joined in. Instinctively, they did not even know who they had hit, but in the eyes of those who were observant, countless people could distinguish between friend and foe. Thus, the chaotic fighting finally had some order. The rumors spread like a plague. The higher-ups of the 7th Corps and the 14th Corps had followed Chief Hugh to commit treason. The personal guards and confidants of the higher-ups clashed with a large number of soldiers. In the end, the two corps could no longer believe whether their comrades around them were on their side or traitors. So the fighting became completely chaotic. The two corps, which had been about to march into Reki City, saw blood, and a large number of people fell. People were making noise everywhere on the battlefield, as if they were shouting at the top of their lungs. At this moment, Hamilton was already dead. As Hugh's student, Doring had already subconsciously believed that his teacher had committed treason. He mobilized all of his trusted subordinates and treated the scene before him as a real war. Amidst the roar of cannon fire, the situation escalated in an instant, and the clamor and shouts from every corner of the battlefield finally became clearer. Countless voices converged into one content: protect the president. In an instant, the two sides of the fighting rushed in Jia Delin's direction at the same time. Gunshots and gunfire, screams and wails. Corpses full of blood and minced flesh fell to the ground, bringing with them endless chaos and cruelty. The war spread directly to Jia Delin. Jia Delin, who was gathering technicians to decode the signal shielding, began to move under the protection of several palace warriors. Soldiers rushed over from all directions, shouting to protect the president. But in such a situation, the elite palace warriors were no longer willing to trust anyone. So in the face of their own country's army, they did not hesitate to start attacking. Lightning and raging fire began to light up. The scene became more and more chaotic. In the despair and anxiety of the end of the world, the technicians finally recovered the new number of the mobile phone. Jia Delin, who was disheartened, immediately dialed Hugh's number. The phone rang once and was quickly connected. Chief Hugh's tone was as usual. "Mr. President, has Reki City been breached?" Jia Delin froze for a moment, and his heart instantly sank to the bottom. With just one sentence, he had already confirmed a fact. Hugh did not commit treason. When the news that the Polar Bear Army had been wiped out affected the morale of the army, everything that happened next was a plot that had been secretly planned for a long time. Jia Delin held the phone. At that moment, it was extremely difficult for him to breathe. He planned to use 2 legions to crush the defense of Wulan State. 2 legions, nearly 70,000 people, which was more than enough. But the other side had reached into the military of Snow Country. In the chaos, the morale of the army collapsed, and the camp was in turmoil. After this battle, how many people were left of the 70,000? Even if there were a lot left, how many were willing to obey his orders? 1,000? Or 10,000? In the hail of bullets. Jia Delin suddenly raised his mobile phone and roared, "Listen to me, I'm Boss Jia Delin." Countless bullets and gunfire flew directly over, drowning out his voice. Beside him, several experts of the thundershocking realm rushed over to block the bullets. Several other palace warriors pulled Jia Delin and continued to move. In the panic, it seemed that countless people were touching his body, almost lifting him up. Jia Delin was burning with anxiety. Countless sweat poured out of his body, and he shouted at the top of his voice. The sun fell and shone on the countless blood and bones in the wilderness. The unprecedented high temperature made Jia Delin's lips dry and cracked. He felt that his body was getting hotter and hotter, as if it was burning every nerve in his body. Finally, his body staggered and fell directly to the ground. "Wait," he said with difficulty, and his breathing seemed to be on fire. "Wait a minute, He had not finished speaking. "President! Mr. President! My God, why?" In countless exclamations of extreme horror, Jia Delin lowered his head in astonishment. At some point, his body really began to catch fire. Thin flames seeped out from every pore of his body, lightly lingering around the surface of his body. An unimaginable heat engulfed his entire body, bringing with it incomparable pain. Jia Delin opened his eyes and opened his mouth. The next second, countless flames came out of his eyes, mouth, ears, and all over his body. He seemed to struggle to get up. In just a moment, the fire rose and President Jia Delin's body, which was about to get up, suddenly turned into ashes. The ashes were flying in the wind. Jia Delin had disappeared. The president of Snow Country, who had personally led the expedition, could no longer reach Reki City. And with the direction of the wind, the ashes of his body seemed to float there. The saint warrior looked in the direction where Jia Delin had disappeared with a dull face. After a long time, a voice with a sobbing tone suddenly sounded. The president was killed. The whole battlefield was silent for a moment. On the low mountain thousands of meters away, in the world of the telescope, the whole battlefield began to distort little by little after the extreme silence. A clamor of voices rose from afar, and an even more tragic battle broke out. The telescope kept hesitating. Countless soldiers were completely swept away in confusion and anger. In their sight, on the large battlefield, the number of people was decreasing at a speed visible to the naked eye almost every moment. The flowing blood was like a river, dyeing the whole wilderness red. The man in the military uniform of Snow Country put down the telescope, shrugged, and said, "Jia Delin is dead." His tone was nonchalant. However, this news was enough to shock the whole world. August 24th. The president of Snow Country was assassinated in the process of personally leading the expedition to Reki City. From this moment on, the giant hand, which had been hidden behind the scenes, finally moved slowly. There was a man sitting next to the man. He quickly sent the news of Jia Delin's death and said without raising his head, "Do you want to put Rex into the observation area?" There was a notebook in front of him. Countless windows were flashing on the notebook, and one of the windows was already filled with densely packed names. Those were the spies that had been used before or had already been sacrificed. After this battle, even more people would enter the observation area. He clicked on another window. There were very few names in the window, which meant that there were fewer and fewer pawns that they could use. "No." The man in the military uniform laughed. "From now on, Rex will enter the implementation area. I think he will not be observed for a long time." He took out his mobile phone and dialed a number. The moment the phone was connected, he bent down slightly and said respectfully, "Fortunately, I didn't fail you. The mission has been successfully completed." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone, and then a calm male voice sounded. "You've worked hard. Get ready to retreat." Rex, the man in the military uniform, held the binoculars and hesitated slightly. "That's not what we should care about. Jia Delin is dead. From today on, we just need to see how he performs in Snow Country." The man in the military uniform was silent for a moment, then nodded and said, "Got it." He put down the phone, tidied up his military uniform, and said to his companions, "Retreat." The army passed through. The sun had set in the broken city. The dim light shone on the temporary base of the Black Dragon Army. In the atmosphere of iron and blood, the garrison was full of fatigue but extremely sharp anger. The governor's mansion had been completely destroyed. Sitting in the completely destroyed ruins, Dong Qingwudi looked down at the city under his feet and remained silent. There was a battle report at his feet. At this time, the news that Jia Delin, the president of Snow Country, was assassinated had spread throughout the Dark World. The battle between the 7th Corps and the 14th Corps had stopped not long ago. The crazy crowd completely lost their minds under the stimulation of Jia Delin's death. The two corps, which had nearly 70,000 people, ended up with less than 20,000 people. The survivors had almost no fighting spirit. However, Ross State and Oga State sent less than 15,000 troops, and it only took them half an hour to disperse the survivors of the two corps. After this battle, it was certain that Snow Country would abolish the establishment of the 7th and the 14th Corps forever. Of course, the premise was that Snow Country could continue to exist. But now it seemed that whether Snow Country could continue to exist depended largely on the will of Dongqing Wudi. Lieutenant General Wang Qianzhong, the commander of the Black Dragon Army, stood beside Dongqing Wudi and reported the battle damage. That's about it. Now we have nearly 50,000 people who can fight. If the minister agrees, the Black Dragon Army still has 30,000 available troops, which can arrive as soon as possible. In addition, Marshal Jiang has transferred troops from several other corps of the Border Control Corps. In 3 days, more than 100,000 people from the Pegasus Corps and the Wild Sand Corps will enter Snow Country from Liaodong. Within a week, this number can increase to 200,000. In half a month. Forget it. Dongqing Wudi waved his hand. Send an order for all the follow-up troops of the Pegasus Corps and the Wild Sand Corps to retreat. Qianzhong, you have to work hard to count the wounded and victims of the Black Dragon Army. The compensation must be in place as soon as possible. You have to keep an eye on this matter personally. No accidents are allowed. Wang Qianzhong hesitated and said subconsciously, but Marshal Jiang has… what? Dongqing Wudi raised his eyebrows. With a faint smile, he said, Marshal Jiang is far away in the south. Do you still want to order me? I'm still here. Do you think my judgment of the situation is not as good as that little guy's? Wang Qianzhong's face changed, and he shook his head with a bitter smile. Minister, you know that's not what I mean. He had always called Dongqing Wudi minister, and the boundary was extremely clear. And the Marshal Jiang he called was naturally Jiang Hongwei, the new commander of the Border Control Corps codenamed Dijiang. Wang Qianzhong was the former commander of the Arctic Ocean Command and one of the corps generals of the Wang family of Beihai. After he exchanged posts with Cheng Huaining, the former commander of the Black Dragon Army, his experience in the Black Dragon Army was even more embarrassing than Cheng Huaining's. This embarrassment was vividly reflected in Dongqing Wudi's personal expedition to Snow Country. The moment Dongqing Wudi appeared in the Black Dragon Army, the whole Black Dragon Army seemed to have a soul. It was an unparalleled fanaticism. They broke through the Divine Shield Corps and charged all the way. In countless battles, Wang Qianzhong didn't even give any decent orders. He stood beside Dongqing Wudi and was completely a messenger. And it was foreseeable that as long as the battle continued, he would continue like this. Dongqing Wudi glanced at him, waved his hand, and said, You still don't understand. Jia Delin was assassinated. No matter what happens to Snow Country in the future, at least in the chaos, Snow Country is destined to exit miserably. This also means that the war has come to an end. What do we want to do by mobilizing the army at this time? To completely conquer Snow Country? If that's the case, other countries won't agree. He looked into the distance, at Kamas, which was 200 miles away. Vaguely, he could almost feel the panic in that city. If we want to deter Snow Country, these people are enough. At least for now, we don't need to do meaningless things. Wang Qianzhong was silent for a while, then nodded and said, I see. Go and inform the logistics department to make some delicious food, but don't relax. Alcohol is forbidden. You can choose whatever ingredients you want. If you don't have enough, where can you find them in such a big city? Just go and get them. Also, the compensation I mentioned just now must be treated as a top priority. Come over later and visit the injured with me. Dongqing Wudi looked at the sky. The setting sun was like blood. He shook his head and said, Take a rest tonight. There's no need to worry about defeating Kamas. Wang Qianzhong gritted his teeth, nodded, and turned to leave. Not long after he left, Tang Guizheng, the vice commander of the Black Dragon Army, came over and called him marshal with a smile. Dongqing Wudi glanced at him and didn't bother to pay attention to him. He didn't care about being rude to his own people. Tang Guizheng was burly and rough in managing the army, but he had always been disciplined. Among the generals and even the colonels of the Border Control Corps, his education was not high, but he fought bravely and paid great attention to military law. His strength at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm was enough to convince the masses. Therefore, his army had always been the one that violated the least rules in the whole Zhongzhou state. He was Dongqing Wudi's confidant when he first entered the Border Control Corps. Although he was no longer young and was close to 40 years old, in Dongqing Wudi's eyes, he was always a child. Tang Guizheng didn't mind Dongqing Wudi's attitude at all. He smiled and approached Dongqing Wudi. He took out a crumpled cigarette and handed it to Dongqing Wudi. He took out a lighter and smiled politely. "Marshal, would you like a cigarette?" Dongqing Wudi took the cigarette and lit it. He took a puff and said, "Let's make it clear first. If you have something to say, just say it. But if you want to bring up the past again, you don't have to say it." Tang Guizheng's face turned red. He looked at Dongqing Wudi with hidden bitterness. "What a jerk!" Dongqing Wudi laughed and scolded, "What? Do you dislike Wang Qianzhong so much? It's the overall will of Zhongzhou state that he comes to the Black Dragon army. Oh, you want to leave because you can't change it? And you want to be a guard by my side? Damn it, after this fight, you'll have 2 golden stars on your shoulders. When have you ever seen a guard at the level of lieutenant general? In your mind, is being a high-ranking officer in the army not as good as running errands by my side? That's certainly not as good." Tang Guizheng opened his mouth and laughed. His eyes were extremely sincere. Dongqing Wudi shook his head. "Like I said, it's impossible. Even if Zhongzhou state agrees, I won't. Talent is not used like this." In fact, it was very easy to transfer Tang Guizheng away. As long as he communicated with the Wang family of Beihai, the Wang family of Beihai, who was eager to open up the situation in the Border Control Corps, would definitely send Tang Guizheng off with both hands. With him in the Black Dragon army, he, the vice commander, was more majestic than the real commander, Wang Qianzhong. If he could be sent away, as long as the Southeast group was not a fool, how could they refuse? But it was impossible for Dongqing Wudi to give up the Border Control Corps. As long as Tang Guizheng was still in the Black Dragon army, no matter who the commander of the Black Dragon army changed, Dongqing Wudi's right to speak would not be affected in a short time. Tang Guizheng grinned and said, "Marshal, you also think I'm a talent, don't you? I heard that in this chaos, the performance of the Arctic Ocean Command is extremely poor. Boss Ching just took office not long ago, so it shouldn't affect him much. Wang Qianzhong will probably suffer a lot. To sum up the reason, the Arctic Ocean Command's performance is so poor because there aren't many people around Boss Cheng. Marshal, you know how well I work with old Cheng. I'm just wondering if I can go to the Arctic Ocean Command and get a position as the deputy commander or chief of staff. If I can't win, I don't want the merit this time. Just get me somewhere else." Dongqing Wudi looked at him, expressionless. Tang Guizheng's smile gradually disappeared, and he settled for the next best thing. He chuckled and said, "If it doesn't work, let me go to Tiananmen and stay with His Little Highness. That bastardly Zhonghu is so arrogant around His Little Highness. If I go there, what will happen to him?" Dongqing Wudi narrowed his eyes. "Marshal," Tang Guizheng's expression became serious. "I've thought about it carefully. After this time, you must take advantage of the situation in the military. I wonder if there is a place for me? This is a little big, and I have to consider all aspects. I can't answer you now." Dongqing Wudi had a headache. "Let's wait and see. Even if you want to leave, you have to arrange a successor. There are more than 100,000 good men in the Black Dragon army. If you leave, it will be your responsibility if anything goes wrong in the future. Do you know that?" "Yes." Tang Guizheng laughed and took out a cigarette again. Dongqing Wudi waved his hand. "Get out of here." His cell phone rang. Dongqing Wudi took out his cell phone and glanced at it. His eyes softened slightly. He answered the phone and said, "Hello. Are you busy?" On the phone, Bai Qingxian's voice sounded soft and elegant. "I'm fine." Dongqing Wudi smiled and looked at the setting sun that was no longer dazzling. "I've just taken down Norev City. I can have a good rest tonight." If there are no accidents, the negotiation with Snow Country should arrive tomorrow at the latest. Bai Qingqian hesitated slightly. Jia Delin's death, is it related to Samsara Palace? I don't know. Dongqing Wudi softly interrupted his wife's words. It's too sensitive to investigate the truth of this kind of thing. Anyway, the facts are right now. As soon as Jia Delin died, Snow Country was destined to exit from the chaos. This time they suffered heavy losses and were in internal chaos. I guess they didn't have the mood to investigate other things. Bai Qingqian agreed. This is an opportunity. Some time ago, our family was under a lot of pressure. Now with this incident, we can relieve it. The Southeast group is too aggressive. I'll deal with these things. Don't act rashly. Dongqing Wudi's voice was very light, but it was unquestionable. The noble and elegant Madame Dongqing and the border governor's secretary Bai were the same person, but most of the time they were not the same person. Bai Qingqian, who seemed to be gentle and calm, was extremely decisive and fierce in dealing with things. In many cases, she was even vicious to her enemies. Whether in Qinzhou or now in Liaodong, although Bai Qingqian was a woman, she was an iron-fisted person who was both respected and feared. Some time ago, because of Dongqing Wudi's transfer of troops, the whole giant group was under unprecedented pressure. In a short time, 3 of Dongqing Wudi's old subordinates had been defeated. If this matter was handled well, it would be enough to quell the aftermath of the transfer of troops. Dongqing Wudi was afraid that his wife was not reconciled and wanted to get something back. Internal strife was different from external warfare. Many things could not be rushed. I understand. Bai Qingqian smiled. I'm in Liaodong now. I called you to ask our marshal what support he needs. I promised to make a backup plan. Dongqing Wudi laughed and said seriously, Thank you, Secretary Bai. The flames of war burned. After the smoke of gunpowder, the husband and wife, who had a frozen relationship, finally gradually got along and became intimate again. Bai Qingqian was silent for a while and said softly, You still have to pay attention to your side. This time, when you march into Snow Country, there will be no gossip at home, only praise for your merits. But the international voice is not good. At that time, it is inevitable that some people will say that you are cruel and inhuman. You know, I don't care about that. Dongqing Wudi said lightly. He thought for a moment and continued, No, I still care. I care about those international comments, but I don't expect them to praise me. I just think they are not cruel enough. I am indeed cruel, but so what? They can say that I am a beast, a butcher, and an executioner. It doesn't matter. The more they say, the happier I am. Because when these comments fall into the ears of the enemy, they can clearly realize what kind of person Dongqing Wudi is. I just chatted with President Hua Cheng, and he said that we are all people who have no way out. I agree with this. In fact, not only us, but anyone who has a concern behind us has no way out. In life, when we carry something, we are destined to move forward. I have you, the Dongqing clan, and hundreds of thousands of troops behind me, so I have no way out. I am the god of massacre. Naturally, I have to kill. I have to kill more people. The worse my international reputation is, the more they will be afraid of me. In this way, the people behind me and my family will be safer. Dongqing Wudi said quietly. His voice was warm, but his eyes were extremely cold. Qingqian, believe it or not, if I fall in Snow Country this time, our father and children, you and me, and all the people in the Dongqing clan will die miserably. At that time, none of us will have a good end. He paused and laughed. So I can't fall, and I will never fall. When Tianlan really grows up, I can take over my burden. I will always stand here. As long as I am here, the Dongqing clan and the Bai clan will be there. Bai Qingqian sighed softly, a little absent-minded. Perhaps everyone who reached a high position had this kind of fear deep in their hearts. With fear and concern, they could no longer retreat or compromise. You have an early rest. I'll hang up first. If there is no accident, I will go back with Tianlan. Dongqing Wudi laughed. Bai Qingqian nodded. Hearing that Dongqing Wudi was as silent as ever, she took the initiative to hang up the phone. The setting sun outside the city finally went down. Night fell. Dongqing Wudi put away his mobile phone and slowly stood up. On the evening of August 24th, the news that President Jia Delin of Snow Country was assassinated spread to all corners of the world in the fastest time and made the headlines of various countries. Li Huaqing and the patriarchs of the wealthy families in Reki City looked at the news in astonishment. After repeated confirmations, the whole Reki City instantly became a sea of revelry. At the same time, countless countries in the camp of Snow Country began to call back the troops they had sent to Mormons, and at the same time, they sent envoys with enough weight to Reki City to see Li Huaqing. On this night, the Black Dragon Legion of less than 50,000 people stationed in a city 200 miles away from Kamas. On this night, after the chaotic high-level meeting of Snow Country, which had no leader, and facing Dongqing Wudi's increasingly quiet army, everyone finally made the most difficult decision. Snow Country officially gave up Mormons. All the legions that went to Mormons withdrew and reconsolidated their defensive areas. The Foreign Affairs Minister of Snow Country left Kamas in person and paid a visit to Dongqing Wudi. The general trend over Eastern Europe was still roaring. On this night, after Rothschild, the Shadow Throne, the Heroes Club, the Men in Black, the Jiang family of South America, Knights Templars, the Vatican, Violet, Morton, and other major forces left one after another, Snow Country, one of the world's superpowers, finally admitted defeat and left with a heavy price in the chaos. The end was in sight. The border of Eisen Federation was completely desolate. When the battle in Mormons was at its most stalemate, Eisen Federation almost sent out most of its troops. The Federation, which was empty inside, was crushed by Li Tianlan again. Now the whole country was almost in a state of defenselessness. It was cold and quiet, looking extremely miserable. The fluttering white robe quietly crossed the border of the Eisen Federation and continued moving forward. The red dagger hung on the hem of her white dress, swaying gently as she walked, flashing with red arcs of light. When she was about to enter Snow Country, Li Shi took out a positioning device. On the small screen, a red light spot was flashing gently. Li Shi operated it casually and planned a clear route. Then she moved faster than before. That place was the gathering place of all the forces of Kunlun City in Eastern Europe. In the 20 years since the rise of Zhongzhou State, Kunlun City, which had no background, wholeheartedly consolidated its position in Zhongzhou State. In the extremely important Eastern Europe, it did not even leave a base. Among all the major forces, Kunlun City might be the only one that had to rely on positioning devices to gather in the wilderness. The scattered team of only a few hundred people set up a small camp in the wilderness. When Li Shi responded to the reconnaissance signal and came over, an extremely ugly man with a broken arm led everyone to greet her. "Madam, I'm Bloody Hand." The old man with a broken arm bowed slightly and said in a respectful tone. He was an expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, close to the half-step invincible realm. Before Li Shi officially arrived at the theater of operations, he was the commander-in-chief here. Li Shi glanced at him indifferently, and there was no expression on her delicate and beautiful face. The wind blew over. In the increasingly awkward atmosphere, she suddenly said, "Is everyone here?" Bloody Hand also seemed a little embarrassed. "Madam, although there are few people here, I can guarantee that they are all elites of Kunlun City. Li Tianlan can lead hundreds of people to defeat the 6 groups of Snow Country, and we also." "You?" Li Shi glanced at him. "Do you think you deserve to compare with Li Tianlan? Not to mention others, can you stop Li Tianlan's sword now?" Bloody Hand's face turned red, but he did not dare to say anything. Li Shi glanced at the crowd in front of her, shook her head, and said softly, "It's really shabby." Bloody Hand gave a wry smile and did not know what to say. After all, Kunlun City's rise was too short, and it did not pay enough attention to the outside of Zhongzhou State. Judging from the performance of the chaos in Eastern Europe, any second-rate force in the dark world that had developed for a long time seemed to be much calmer than Kunlun City. Hundreds of people met in the wilderness. Thinking about it carefully, it could be said as a joke. Madam, although Kunlun City has no foundation in the outside world now, after this victory, Bloody Hand braced himself to say, and then his words were directly interrupted by Li Shi. Li Shi suddenly said. Bloody Hand looked up in amazement. In his sight, Li Shi's eyes were clear and bright, crystal clear, like the stars in the night sky. Bloody Hand blinked. What? I mean, Kunlun City will not win in Eastern Europe. He thought of today's intelligence. Gu Xingyun, the governor of Kunlun City, vomited blood and fainted on the spot when he presided over the internal meeting of Kunlun City. After suppressing the injury for so long, it finally reached the time when it could not be suppressed. Li Shi's eyes were a little dazed with inexplicable emotions. Bloody Hand suddenly realized that something was wrong, and his body subconsciously took a step back. Li Shi's eyes had completely locked on Bloody Hand. I still remember you, she said softly. Bloody Hand forced a smile and subconsciously looked at his arm. Do you still remember me? Li Shi's voice was very gentle. Bloody Hand's face gradually became pale. It's been so many years, Li Shi said softly, as if she was lost in memory. In fact, your lineup could not kill him. Even if summer solstice destroyed the infinite sky, you could not kill him. She was silent for a while. Bloody Hand, do you remember what you did back then? You kidnapped an old man and used him to coerce a pregnant woman. Li Shi smiled softly. You poisoned the pregnant woman and wanted to poison the child in her belly. Bloody Hand's eyes were a little desperate. Of course, he remembered those things. The pregnant woman at that time was not someone else, but Li Shi in front of him. You said it was easy to save the lives of the old man and the child. You told the pregnant woman that you only needed one sword. Then that silly woman, Li Shi's tone was absent-minded and tears flowed down from her eyes. After many years, this seemed to be the first time she shed tears. Her numb heart was shaking and gradually broke through the dusty ice. That silly woman really took out a sword at the most critical time and aimed it at the man she loved most. Her voice was shaking. But what you don't know is that many years later, when the pregnant woman saw the man she had killed once again, all the feelings she had for him were gone, not even a little bit. She could only see disgust and hatred in his eyes. She smiled. It was only then that she understood. The reason why he didn't fight back when the sword pierced his heart was not because he loved her. Perhaps he did, but when the sword flashed, all his feelings were gone. The reason why he didn't fight back was to protect the child in the woman's belly. Bloody Hand's body began to tremble. Li Shi cried out. He was also a fool, because neither he nor the pregnant woman at that time thought that after everything was over, the person who kidnapped her father and wanted to poison her child did not keep his promise. The child was born, but he directly fell to death. Bloody Hand suddenly knelt down, and his body trembled. Madam, this is the order of the governor. I know. Li Shi looked down at him and blinked her eyes. In the tears, the depths of her eyes were full of ice and snow. But now your governor is seriously injured and unconscious. Who can protect you? Bloody Hand raised his head in amazement. In his sight, the beautiful face was full of memories. I don't know what I want to do, but I think since he can't protect you, he can't control me. For so many years, I want to be myself for once. Madam, Bloody Hand's voice trembled. Li Shi's body gradually rose. The sword light lingered in the field. My name is Li Shi, he said. A sharp and bright sword light suddenly shone in the vast and empty night. The sword light twisted and split in the air, and countless sword energies surged in an instant. Silently, it tore into countless sword lights and spread to the crowd. Bloody Hand's face was full of horror. He still wanted to say something, but the sword light had already shrouded him. His body was torn into countless pieces by the sword light in an instant. The pain spread. At the moment when his consciousness was about to disappear, he seemed to hear Li Shi's voice. But what you don't know is that it was not my child who fell to death that year. The eternal darkness swallowed everything. Under the sword, hundreds of elites left by Kunlun City in Eastern Europe turned into minced meat in an instant. Li Shi fell to the ground, and her white clothes fluttered. At this moment she was herself. Her eyes looked in the direction of Mormons, thinking about everything in the past. The end had begun. She took a step forward and whispered to herself, "I'm coming." You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.